Hey guys, tonight we begin in the silent gold-touched halls of Versailles. The candles are low. The drapes are impossibly thick. And somewhere in this echoing palace, yes, behind that embroidered door, you'll find Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, navigating the trickiest courtship rituals since middle school lunch tables. Except here, the stakes involve entire duchies and a suspicious number of velvet gloves. You wander these marble corridors in soft slippers, your footfalls nearly inaudible beneath gilded cherubs and painted ceilings. Outside, the formal gardens sleep beneath the moonlight, hedges trimmed like military ranks. But in here, the palace pulses gently with whispers, perfume, and the barely audible sound of secrets being passed from one powdered wig to another. Louis XIV isn't just France's most majestic king. He's also, quite possibly, its most prolific romantic. Officially, he's married to Maria Theresa of Spain. Unofficially, you're going to need a royal registry just to keep track of his mistresses. The most famous of these, Madame de Montespan, didn't just steal the king's heart. She rearranged the entire court to fit her taste. She had a private chapel, private apartments, and depending on the gossip pamphlets, private séances. Yes, historians still argue whether she dabbled in black magic or was simply great at palace PR. You pass a tapestry of the king riding into battle, but what they don't show is that Louis often made time for love even on campaign. There's a particularly scandalous tale, possibly apocryphal, of him disappearing from the battlefield tent for an hour, only to return refreshed and ready to dictate troop movements, priorities. And while Versailles is an architectural marvel, it was also one enormous flirtation machine. The Hall of Mirrors, less about diplomacy, more about catching someone's eye across the room, then casually adjusting your lace cuffs like you weren't watching them all night. You lean against the cool marble wall as you imagine it, fans fluttering, eyes darting, lovers communicating entirely through sighs and sideways glances. Honestly, the royal dating scene makes modern texting look brutally efficient. Now remember, Louis wasn't sneaking around. His mistresses were semi-official roles. They were even given the title maîtresse en titre, which basically translates to "this is the side chick with a business card." The king's favourite women were awarded titles, estates, and pensions. Sometimes they even attended state functions, sitting just a polite chair away from the queen. You can almost hear the strained small talk at those royal dinners. The dynamic between Maria Theresa and Louis was, well, chilly. She bore him 6 children and endured the humiliation of public infidelity with saintly resignation. But did she love him? Did he ever love her? Historians still debate that. There's a telling anecdote. When Maria Theresa died, Louis reportedly said, "This is the first trouble she has ever caused me." Romantic, right? But let's pivot slightly because we need to talk about Madame de Maintenon, the second act in Louis's romantic life. She began as a governess to his illegitimate children, then she became his secret wife. Probably, maybe. We still don't have the receipts. They likely married in a private ceremony, but there was no announcement, no tiara, no first dance. Just a deeply religious bond, whispers in corridors, and a shift in the king's demeanour. Louis, the man who once threw week-long parties, suddenly became devout and boring. Maintenon had that kind of influence. You stand at the edge of the royal chapel now. In your imagination, Louis kneels before the altar, no longer the swaggering Sun King, but an aging man craving spiritual peace and emotional comfort. His final years were marked by tragedy, war, death, gout, and yet Maintenon remained by his side even when his body gave out and his glittering court turned cold. And what about the others? The lesser-known lovers who fluttered briefly through the palace like moths in the candlelight? Some names are forgotten, others deliberately erased. There's Louise de la Vallière, who gave up everything to become a nun after their affair ended. A French Cinderella turned cloistered ghost. There's a fringe theory, unsupported but juicy, that she'd caught a glimpse of her replacement and fled before things turned catty. You trail your hand along the banister of a curving stair. The marble is worn smooth, perhaps by generations of silken shoes, or perhaps by mistresses fleeing awkward, morning after breakfasts. The entire structure of Versailles encouraged intrigue. Bedrooms opened into salons, salons into ballrooms. You couldn't walk 10 paces without someone overhearing your secrets, which might explain why the king's affairs weren't so much hidden as choreographed. Louis XIV built his image carefully, a godlike ruler, beloved of Apollo, center of the universe. But behind the mirrors and gold leaf, you see the vulnerable man, lonely, aging and grasping for warmth wherever he could find it. Tonight you slip out of his world, your thoughts heavy with perfume and politics, hearts and heraldry. The chandeliers dim, the corridors fall silent, and somewhere far below, in the servants' quarters, the gossip never stops. You drift quietly from the gold-laced hallways of Versailles into the cool grey shadows of Tudor England, where everything smells faintly of damp stone, burning tallow, and a surprising amount of political anxiety. Now you stand in the presence of a monarch who ruled without ever marrying, a queen who cultivated a myth as carefully as her hairstyle. Elizabeth I is the so-called Virgin Queen and the subject of more court whispers than a prom night chaperone with a secret. She walks ahead of you now, graceful, commanding, and just a bit intimidating in that high, ruffled collar that looks like it could decapitate a man if she turned her head too fast. Her gown rustles like paper lanterns. Her presence glows brighter than the torchlight. And no one, not a soul at court, quite knows who shares her heart, or her bed, or if anyone ever did. The term Virgin Queen wasn't just branding, it was political armor. In a time when monarchs were expected to marry for alliances and offspring, Elizabeth turned celibacy into statecraft. By staying single, she dodged the pressure of foreign influence, outmaneuvered Parliament, and kept every ambitious duke and desperate king on his toes, always hoping she'd choose their hand, or at least dance with them at court. But just because she wore white didn't mean her heart was empty. No. You turn a corner and see him, well, a portrait of him, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Tall, handsome, loyal, and constantly at her side. Rumours of their love affair swirled for decades, and historians still argue whether they were ever lovers or simply emotionally entangled for a lifetime. Elizabeth once called him her eyes. He called her Sweet Robin, which is either adorable or slightly confusing from a branding perspective. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, mysteriously fell down a flight of stairs and died, the court practically imploded. Was it an accident, suicide, or a carefully timed push? You'll be shocked to learn we still don't know. The scandal was enough to make Elizabeth back off. Marrying Dudley after Amy's suspicious death would have looked, well, guilty at best, murderous at worst. So Elizabeth kept him close, but always at arm's length. You picture the two of them standing at a palace window, she in glittering pearls, he in tight hose, and probably some sort of awkward codpiece situation. They're smiling politely, but there's tension in the air. You imagine her saying, "If I marry you, I lose England. If I don't, I lose you." You try not to tear up or laugh at the codpiece. It's all very period drama meets office romance. Later came the Duke of Anjou, a French suitor she flirted with in her 50s, an age most queens were expected to fade into prayer and embroidery. Instead, Elizabeth entertained marriage negotiations with a man 2 decades younger, with the energy of a golden retriever and a moustache that could poke an eye. Her court was scandalized, her people booed in the streets. Elizabeth, of course, loved the attention. She always knew how to wield a flirtation like a rapier. And yet, she never married. No ring, no vows, no heirs. Just decades of carefully balanced emotional entanglements and romantic almosts. It's hard to say whether she was protecting her power or her heart. Maybe both. She once declared, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England," which is one way to dodge your relatives asking why you're still single. You stroll past portraits of courtiers, dozens of men who longed for her, pledged loyalty, and occasionally tried a little too hard. One even carved romantic poetry into trees near her hunting grounds. Another gave her a jewel-studded frog, which, romantic or not, feels like a risky move for a queen known for beheadings. Yet even in her loneliness, Elizabeth crafted an aura of eternal youth and divine distance. Her face powdered ghost white, lips painted rose red, she transformed herself into something between a goddess and a statue, a living myth. She celebrated her birthdays like national holidays. She danced until sunrise. She gave rousing speeches in armor. She was quite literally the moment. Behind the makeup, though, was a woman who aged, who grieved, and who almost certainly cried when Dudley died in 1588. She kept the letter he wrote her, found in a locked box by her bed after her death. There's no joke here, just silence. Some scholars believe she may have had medical issues that made marriage risky or intimacy complicated. Others say she had deep emotional scars from watching her mother, Anne Boleyn, be executed by her father, Henry VIII. Trust issues? That's putting it mildly. Elizabeth grew up knowing love could be a death sentence, and in a way, her abstinence gave her power. By removing herself from marriage and motherhood, she existed above typical roles. She became England, not a wife, not a mother, a symbol. And yet in her poems and letters there are flickers, moments when her words ache with longing, weariness, and loneliness. A queen who had everything, and no one who could truly hold her hand. As you leave her chamber, you feel the weight of that golden crown, the cold of the stone floor, and the warmth of a heart that history tried to freeze into legend. Sleepily your footsteps echo through the palace gate. You step softly now into the dim amber light of a Parisian study, cluttered with ink bottles, unfolded maps, and the heavy scent of dried violets. Outside the cannons thunder, but in here the silence is broken only by the scratch of a quill, a love letter in progress. It's 1804, and Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, is writing to Josephine again. Yes, again. It's tempting to think of Napoleon as all boots, brimstone, and battlefield bluster, but the man was, how shall we say, intensely emotional, and deeply, almost uncomfortably, obsessed with his first wife. "I don't love you," Josephine once reportedly said, "but I will try to." That's not a great start. But Napoleon, short in stature and wildly insecure, decided that what he lacked in height he'd make up for in relentless romantic intensity. You probably know the line already. "I awake full of you. Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." That's just the beginning. He also wrote things like, "Come, come, come, I want to see you," and "My one and only Josephine, apart from you, there is no joy." It's like Shakespeare, but French and a little sweaty. Josephine, meanwhile, often didn't write back. You imagine him pacing near a rain-streaked window, mumbling, "She must be busy," while the messenger waits awkwardly by the door with yet another unopened scroll. While Napoleon was fighting entire coalitions across Europe, Josephine was usually at home, gardening, shopping, and attending salons where flattery bloomed faster than roses. She wasn't disloyal so much as practically French. Her love life before and during their marriage had more entanglements than a period drama subplot. Their union began in 1796 when Napoleon was still just a promising general. Josephine, 6 years older, elegant, widowed, and a little financially sketchy, saw potential. He saw destiny. She called him Bonaparte. He called her the one whose letters make him weep into his uniform. They married in a civil ceremony so rushed that she lied about her age and he about his. It wasn't exactly a fairy tale. She forgot to show up on time. He, being deeply in love, forgave her instantly. You, peeking through the curtains of history, may not be as quick. Their letters tell the story of mismatched affection. He worshipped, she managed. He returned from campaign after campaign, longing for her arms. She frequently had guests over, sometimes gentlemen guests. The scandal didn't escape him. In fact, his letters grew more frantic. Historians still argue whether Napoleon truly knew the extent of her affairs or chose not to fully believe it until later. like a man slowly realizing his favorite movie is a little problematic. But power shifts everything. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, literally taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head, he elevated Josephine to empress. She was beside him in all the paintings, all the ceremonies, all the propaganda, but still, no heir. You shift uncomfortably as you recall the quieter parts of royal duty. Josephine had 2 children from her first marriage, but was unable to conceive with Napoleon. And while he may have loved her in his bones and his boots and his battlefield tents, France wanted an heir. So he made a brutal decision: divorce. You're there now, ghost-like in the room, as they sit side by side. The court gathers. Josephine cries dramatically. Napoleon tries to look noble. She signs the papers with trembling hands. He gives her a generous allowance, a palace, and a lifetime of flowers. But the love, that doesn't go away. He marries Marie-Louise of Austria next, who does give him a son. But it's not the same. Josephine remains in his heart. They continue to write, they visit. She gardens at Malmaison. He campaigns in Russia. And then, almost poetically, she dies in 1814, just weeks before he's exiled. Legend, softly disputed but delicious, says that as Napoleon lay dying on the island of St. Helena, surrounded by memories, uniforms, and whatever, passed for tropical decor in political banishment, his final word was, "Josephine, you stand now at the edge of a garden path, mist curling around your shoes. This is Malmaison. The roses still bloom, the fountains still whisper. And though the wars have ended and empires have crumbled, there's something oddly comforting in knowing that even conquerors, especially conquerors, can be completely undone by love." You sigh, warmed by candlelight and mildly concerned by the sheer number of pages Napoleon filled with romantic pleading. You wonder what a text thread between him and Josephine would look like. Probably a lot of "you there" and "read at 11:07 a.m. But even amid all the military genius and political scheming, Napoleon's love letters reveal something fragile and deeply human. He wasn't just the man who redrew the map of Europe. He was the guy refreshing his inbox, hoping his wife missed him too. And maybe, in a way, that's the most relatable thing he ever did. You step softly now into a warmly lit chamber at Whitehall Palace. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax polish and expensive scandal. There's laughter in the distance, raucous, slightly drunk, and likely spilling from behind a curtain that was supposed to be closed. You're in the court of Charles II, the original party king, the so-called Merry Monarch, and if you thought the last monarchs had complicated love lives, oh dear. You ease into a velvet chair near the hearth and immediately someone tries to flirt with you. That's the energy here. Charles II didn't so much keep mistresses as collect them. Tall ones, smart ones, actresses, noblewomen, a French spy or two. If there was a woman within a mile of his court who made people stare, Charles probably noticed and possibly promoted her to Lady of the Bedchamber, which, ironically, was sometimes more bed than chamber. He officially recognized at least 13 of his illegitimate children. That's not counting the maybes, almost certains, and one time at a masquerade, stories. And he gave these children titles, dukedoms, estates. One of his sons became the Duke of Monmouth, another became the Duke of Grafton. At some point it started to look like he was just handing out peerages like candy. You imagine him now reclining in a chair with his famously long legs stretched out, a glass of wine in one hand, and some powdered beauty perched on the armrest, whispering something that is either a secret or a joke, or both. Charles, with his dark curls and sleepy eyes, wasn't just a king, he was a vibe. Among his most famous mistresses was Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, bold, brash, undeniably charismatic. She stormed through court like a thunderclap wrapped in velvet. People hated her, feared her, gossiped about her, but Charles adored her. She bore him 5 children, insulted the Queen to her face, and reportedly once threw a shoe at a bishop. Iconic behaviour. Then came Nell Gwyn, the actress turned royal favourite, common-born, quick-witted, and known for saying things like, "I'm the Protestant whore." when mistaken for someone else's mistress. Charming, no. She won hearts with laughter rather than lineage, and somehow managed to avoid the toxic court rivalries that consumed others. You drift through Charles's private chambers. Well, you think they're private, but given the number of people coming and going, it's more of a social lounge with sheets. The walls are lined with paintings, some commissioned, others, let's call them inspired by real events. The mood here is loose, relaxed, scandalously warm. What's fascinating, though, is that Charles wasn't just a hedonist. He used his love life as soft diplomacy, giving titles to mistresses' relatives, arranging court appointments for their brothers, securing peace with France through bedroom conversations. His romantic affairs were often political tools with silk ribbons tied around them. Meanwhile, his wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, quietly endured the circus. A Portuguese princess, devoutly Catholic, childless, and profoundly out of place in this risque carnival of Restoration England. She loved tea, embroidery, and Charles. He did not return the intensity, but he respected her. When Parliament tried to push her aside, Charles refused. "She is my wife, and I will not part with her," he reportedly said. Touching, if you ignore the dozen women climbing out the back window. Still, some historians wonder whether Charles ever truly loved any one woman or whether he simply loved being loved. He was exiled in his youth, hunted, hungry, alone. When he returned to England and claimed his crown, perhaps he just never wanted to feel lonely again. Or maybe, after years of hiding and hardship, he decided pleasure was the most logical revenge. You rest now near the fireplace, watching the flames dance like the shadows of court intrigue. A page rushes past with a note for the Duchess of Portsmouth, another of Charles's favourites. You can't keep track anymore. Even the courtiers gave up trying. One famously said, "It is easier to count the stars than the king's mistresses." And yet, for all the excess, Charles was not unkind. He was unusually tolerant for his time, preferring laughter to cruelty. When a fire ravaged London, he personally coordinated rebuilding efforts. When his dog got kidnapped, he offered a generous reward. Priorities. He died in 1685, his final words reportedly being, "Let not poor Nellie starve." Even in death, he was thinking about his mistress. There's something oddly sweet about that. Now you rise from your seat, making your way out of the candlelit room. The halls echo with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. It's less a royal court than a bohemian fever dream in silk stockings. But somewhere beneath the powdered wigs and carefully arranged cleavage, there lived a king who just wanted to keep the party going. And maybe, just maybe, to forget how it felt when the music stopped. The doors close softly behind Charles II's velvet-draped carnival, and you find yourself in a garden. Not just any garden, but a perfectly trimmed, pastel-hued dream at Versailles once again. This time, though, you aren't following a king. You're trailing behind a queen, a very particular queen, Marie Antoinette. It's early morning, the grass is dew-damp, and the air smells like rosewater and secrets. Somewhere, a harp plays. Somewhere else, someone's whispering about the Count. Because tonight, it's not about revolution or hairdos, it's about what may or may not have happened in Marie Antoinette's most private corners. You glide toward the Hameau de la Reine, her faux village on the palace grounds, where she pretended to be a milkmaid while wearing custom-made gowns worth more than a soldier's annual salary. There's a charm to it, like a child playing house. But beneath the nostalgia whispers buzz. One name, Axel von Fersen, a Swedish count with cheekbones that could slice butter and manners so polished you can see your reflection in them. He met Marie Antoinette when they were both teenagers, and let's just say the tension started early. Eyewitnesses described a great mutual regard, which in royal speak might as well be a neon sign that reads, "Intense eye contact happened here." Fersen was present at many key moments in her life, from masked balls to desperate escapes. In fact, it was Fersen who helped plan and execute the royal family's failed flight during the French Revolution. They disguised themselves as commoners. He arranged the carriages. She wore a peasant dress. It was all very romantic, right up until they got caught 24 hours later and paraded back to Paris like naughty schoolchildren who tried to run away from home with a picnic basket. Historians still argue whether their relationship was platonic or deeply physical. Letters between them were discovered, but many had lines blacked out, redacted with purpose. The kind of redaction that says you do not want to read what was under here unless you're ready for a long sigh and a history podcast. Some of those redactions have now been reversed using modern tech. What do they reveal? Intimacy, emotion, pain. There's one line: "I love you madly and never can stop loving you." Another speaks of sleepless nights and the unbearable strain of absence. Honestly, it sounds like something scribbled on hotel stationery at 2 a.m. You've been there. Still, not everyone agrees. Some argue it was a friendship forged in trauma, a deep, soul-level bond between two people watching their world unravel. Others point to hidden meetings, secret doorways, and the classic "he spent the night" accounts. There's even one particularly juicy fringe theory that claims one of her children may have been his. It's widely dismissed, but you can't deny the drama. Meanwhile, Louis XVI, her actual husband, was around, kind, dutiful, enthralled with locks. Yes, actual locks, padlocks, keys, gears. He loved building them. On their wedding night, he famously fell asleep. The marriage remained unconsummated for 7 years, which in royal terms is about 200 years too long. Eventually they figured it out. Or he did. Or someone gave him a pamphlet. Either way, they had children. But passion, not exactly the palace mood board. Back in the garden, Marie wanders in a gauzy white dress, bonnet tied just so, surrounded by sheep that were, fun fact, washed and perfumed before she visited. You can practically hear the eye rolls of the real dairymaids. She wanted to escape the formality of court. She wanted quiet, intimacy, something real. And perhaps she found that fleetingly with Fersen. Or maybe in solitude, or in the soft creak of wooden floorboards at night when the palace finally stopped breathing down her neck. But the world outside the garden gates was not so gentle. The French people, starving and angry, saw her play acting as insult. Her romances, real or imagined, were twisted into lurid pamphlets and political cartoons. They called her Madame Deficit, the Austrian whore, and worse. Her image became scandal incarnate. One especially infamous pamphlet claimed she was having affairs with her ladies-in-waiting, which was both wildly false and deeply misogynistic, but damaging nonetheless. By the time the revolution came, she was no longer Marie Antoinette, mother and music lover. She was a symbol of excess, decadence, and forbidden pleasure. You shiver slightly as you imagine her final days. No powdered wigs, no harp music, just a cell, a grey dress, and a name reduced to a jeer. When she walked to the guillotine in 1793, she stepped carefully so she wouldn't trip. She apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. That's the kind of grace no palace can teach. And what of Fersen? He mourned her, wrote about her, carried her memory like a pressed flower between the pages of his life. He died many years later, beaten to death by a mob for unrelated political reasons. A tragic symmetry. Now, as you stroll past the quiet hedges, you wonder, was it love? Was it longing? Or was it just two lonely people trying to hold on to something beautiful as the world burned down around them? Either way, the garden remains. And the harp plays on. You leave behind Marie's perfumed pastures and find yourself beneath the sun-bleached sky of Castile, Spain. The stones beneath your feet are hot, the air is still, and through the long shadow of a towering cathedral you glimpse two figures walking side by side, not hand in hand but shoulder to shoulder, bound more tightly by ambition than by touch. This is Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs, the power couple of 15th century Spain, and if the last few royals were tangled up in whispers and romance, this pair is a sharp turn into politics, with just a hint of affection, if you squint hard enough, and have a soft spot for strategy. Isabella and Ferdinand married in 1469, uniting two powerful kingdoms under a single Catholic banner and, fun plot twist, completely lying to the Pope about how closely they were related in order to get a marriage license. Cousins? Sure. But in royal terms, that was practically normal. Just toss a forged papal bull at the problem and voila, wedding bells. You follow them now into a stone hall where sunlight slices through stained glass and everything smells faintly of incense and ambition. Unlike some royal couples, these two worked as a true team. They shared power, often appearing together in court and on coinage. Their motto was literally "Tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando," which loosely translated means, "What matters is that we're equals." If that's not couple goals for the 15th century, what is? Still, behind their professional facade, there were glimmers of something more tender. Letters between them show mutual respect, warm concern, and even a few endearing nicknames. Ferdinand called Isabella "mi querida esposa," my beloved wife. She responded with equal formality, but every now and then her tone softened. There's something quietly beautiful in the way she signed her name beside his, always slightly higher on the page, as if to remind the world who truly held the pen. They had 7 children, most of whom were married off to various European thrones like diplomatic Pokemon cards. One of their daughters, Catherine of Aragon, would go on to marry Henry VIII of England, and we all know how that turned out. Another daughter, Joanna, yes, the one you'll meet again later, became known as La Loca, or the Mad. That story gets complicated. But for now, you sit with Isabella as she writes letters late into the night, a candle guttering low beside her, her quill scratching furiously. She's not drafting love notes, she's coordinating a war. You see, Isabella and Ferdinand weren't just monarchs, they were campaigners. Together, they completed the Reconquista, reclaiming Granada from the Moors in 1492. It was a victory soaked in triumph and controversy. Historians still argue whether their devotion to Catholicism was sincere or politically calculated. Maybe both, maybe neither. Religion, power, and policy were too deeply entangled to unravel cleanly. And then there was the Alhambra Decree. You feel a chill now, despite the Spanish heat, as you remember. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Isabella and Ferdinand ordered the expulsion of all practicing Jews from Spain. Thousands fled, many died, properties were seized. A painful, devastating act carried out in the name of religious unity. This is not a love story, but love stories rarely happen in a vacuum. And yet, despite the politics, the papal alliances, the wars and Inquisition, Isabella and Ferdinand remained tethered. She trusted him with military decisions. He deferred to her in matters of governance. When she died in 1504, Ferdinand wrote, "The death of the Queen, my wife, is for me the greatest sorrow that could come to me in this life." They were not passionate in the operatic sense. There were no secret lovers or scented letters tucked into sleeves. But perhaps their version of love was more enduring. It was a partnership grounded in shared purpose, forged in the fire of empire building, and carried through decades of rule. You glance down at the stone beneath your feet, the floor of the royal chapel of Granada, where they now lie side by side. Not in gold coffins, but in simple lead boxes beneath the grandeur. Humble in death, just as they were calculated in life. And as the chapel darkens and your breath grows slow, you wonder, is it less romantic if love takes the shape of trust, of strategy, of respect? Maybe not. Maybe sometimes the grandest gestures aren't whispered in gardens but signed in treaties, and sometimes love looks like a crown shared and a kingdom built together. The granite vaults of Spain fade behind you, and now you're wandering a narrower corridor, one not quite as golden, not quite as grand, but still heavy with family portraits and deep sighs. Welcome to the Habsburgs. You might want to brace yourself for everything. This is the dynasty where royal matchmaking turned into genetic bingo. You pause before a painted profile. Yes, that jaw. The famously pronounced Habsburg chin, a hereditary gift passed down like a cursed teacup through generations of cousins who, frankly, should not have been marrying each other. You trace the lineages with your finger, uncle weds niece, cousin weds cousin, and somehow they're all still ruling half of Europe. But tonight you focus on one curious truth. Behind those solemn portraits and geometrically unfortunate marriages, the Habsburgs also had a taste for secret affairs. Shocking, I know. You find yourself in the court of Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg king of his line, a man so fragile from generations of inbreeding that courtiers whispered about his every breath. His tongue was too large, his jaw too heavy, his mind foggy. And yet people still hoped he'd produce an heir, which meant royal matchmaking persisted, despite biology practically standing in the doorway shouting, "Please stop." He married twice. Neither marriage produced a child. Historians still debate whether Charles was infertile, impotent, or simply unaware of how any of this was supposed to work. Letters from his court mention his deep piety, frequent confusion, and his belief that his illnesses were caused by witches. Possibly not the ideal foundation for a romantic evening. But further back in the family tree, things get spicier. Take Philip IV of Spain, Charles's great-grandfather. He was married to Elizabeth of France, but let's be honest, monogamy was not a core Habsburg value. Philip had an unquenchable appetite for mistresses and an entire apartment block's worth of illegitimate children. One mistress in particular, Maria Calderon, an actress, bore him a son who would later become a cardinal. Yes, born out of wedlock, yet rose to ecclesiastical power. If that's not irony in a cassock, what is? You creep quietly down palace corridors to the whispered name Mariana of Austria, niece to Philip IV, and later his second wife. Yes, his niece. This is the point in the family history where the branches fold in on themselves like origami. And Mariana, like many Habsburg brides, was less a romantic partner and more of a biological hope chest. She bore children, including Charles II. But if you've been paying attention, you know how that ended. But let's not get stuck in tragedy just yet, because amidst the marble gloom, there's something oddly human here. You see, not all Habsburg love stories were arranged by dynastic desperation. Hidden among the formal alliances and papal dispensations, some members of the family had feelings, secret letters, private rendezvous. One lesser-known Habsburg archduchess once wrote poetry to a court musician. Another reportedly eloped with a Hungarian noble, though the family quickly erased that tale from the official chronicles. There's even speculation that Emperor Rudolph II, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire in the late 1500s, had both male and female lovers, though the records are slippery. He surrounded himself with artists, astrologers, and alchemists, and at night he often retreated to his Kunstkammer, a curiosity cabinet filled with erotic art, preserved animals, and mechanical toys. Freud would have had a field day. Historians still argue whether Rudolph's lifelong bachelorhood was due to preference, depression, or a deeply buried fear of his own family's genetic lottery. But one thing's clear, he wasn't just a ruler, he was a deeply strange man in a deeply strange family, trying to carve out a little private joy in a world that expected heirs above all else. You linger by a tall mirror framed in dark walnut. For a second, you catch your reflection beside that of a distant Habsburg. He looks tired, a little lost, a little lonely. All that power, all that gold. And yet, many of them seem to have lived their lives under glass, studied but never truly touched. Maybe that's the price of marrying for empire. As the wind whistles through the corridors and the candlelight flickers over stone, you start to understand. The Habsburgs weren't tragic because of love lost, but because they were rarely allowed to even choose who to love in the first place. And somewhere, in a hidden drawer behind a tapestry, another unsigned letter still waits. A poem never sent, a sigh never heard. The torches dim and the last echoes of the Habsburg corridors fade into something quieter, more studious, less velvet and roses, more wood-panelled seriousness and lingering pipe smoke. You've crossed into the early 17th century English court, where the air always feels a bit damp and everyone's pretending not to eavesdrop. You're here to shadow a king who wore his crown askew, quoted scripture like poetry, and surrounded himself with young men who seemed to rise suspiciously fast. This is James III of England, James VI of Scotland before that, the first Stuart to rule England after Elizabeth I died without an heir. James was scholarly, often awkward and deeply passionate, especially when it came to his favourites. And you'll want to keep that word in mind, favourites. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting here. James wasn't what you'd call classically handsome, and his fashion choices could generously be described as cosy. But he was witty, devout, politically cunning when he tried to be, and above all, lonely. He never quite fit into the glittering world of English court spectacle, preferring Bible study over banquets, unless, of course, his favourite man was present. Let's start with Robert Carr, who first caught James's eye after falling off a horse during a tilting match. James rushed to his side like a Tudor drama queen and reportedly never looked away again. Carr was young, strikingly good-looking and, until that moment, completely unimportant. Within a year, he was made Viscount Rochester, then Earl of Somerset, then deeply embroiled in one of the most scandalous murder plots of the century. But wait, before the crime, there was the closeness. Letters survive, they're not subtle. James called Carr my sweet child and wife, and referred to himself as your old dad and husband. Even by royal standards, that's personal. Historians still debate whether the relationship was physical. Some say it was a deep, fatherly bond. Others note that the king shared his bedchamber with Carr for years and showered him with titles like confetti. Carr's eventual downfall came not from love, but from politics, and one deeply poisoned man named Sir Thomas Overbury. But just when you think James's love life couldn't get more tangled, enter George Villiers. Villiers, later titled Duke of Buckingham, and almost universally agreed to be the great love of James's life. Tall, elegant, manipulative, in a way that makes court schemers everywhere stand up and applaud. He danced well, he dressed impeccably, and he knew exactly how to keep James's attention. James adored him, wrote to him, gave him everything. One letter says plainly, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." Another refers to Villiers as his sweetheart. He wasn't trying to hide it. He was just hoping everyone else would smile politely and keep drinking their ale. You're sitting now beside a long banquet table. There's pheasant on the platter, gold embroidery on the curtains, and Villiers on the king's left hand, always. You notice how he leans in too close when speaking, how James laughs too quickly at his jokes. You watch other courtiers glance sideways, calculating how much flattery they'll need to stay relevant. It's worth noting that James was also married to Anne of Denmark, and they had several children together, including the future Charles I. But their relationship was distant, respectful, yes, but emotionally frostbitten. Anne preferred masks, hunting, and a court of her own. James, he preferred Villiers in everything. Even after James's death in 1625, Villiers remained powerful under Charles I, which, for the record, did not go well. Parliament loathed him, the people distrusted him, and eventually, in a twist worthy of any royal soap opera, Villiers was assassinated in a Portsmouth inn by a disgruntled soldier. But back in James's reign, everything about their closeness was public, documented, and still somehow wrapped in plausible deniability. One ambassador from Venice once wrote that James leaned on Villiers on all occasions by day and night, and that he kisses him as a mistress. Subtle diplomacy, indeed. And here's the thing, James was deeply religious, a devout Protestant who commissioned the King James Bible. He didn't see his love for Villiers or Carr as sinful. To him, it was affection, loyalty, divine companionship. Maybe that's true. Maybe it wasn't. Historians still argue whether James was gay, bisexual, romantically fluid, or just a lonely man with too much power and a soft spot for attractive courtiers. As you move through the oak-panelled library, you hear echoes of the debates. Was it love? Was it politics? Was it the only kind of safety a man like James could find in a world where feeling too deeply could cost you everything? You pause by a letter sealed in wax, its folds worn from years of handling. You imagine James holding it to his chest, whispering words no advisor ever heard. Maybe he wrote, "Come to me soon." Maybe he didn't write anything at all. But somewhere between the sermons and the statecraft, between the Bibles and the banquets, James found a kind of love that history couldn't quite explain or contain, and that in itself is worth remembering. You leave the damp halls of James's affections behind, and now you're blinking in the frosted brilliance of St. Petersburg. The walls are taller, the furs are thicker, the politics still very much tangled in lace, power, and candlelit insinuation. Here comes Catherine the Great. Yes, that Catherine. And whether or not the rumours you've heard are true, she is already 4 steps ahead of you. You follow her across an icy courtyard where snow crunches beneath the heels of her embroidered boots. Servants bow, pages freeze in place. You try to keep up. You can't. She's already vanished into a corridor that smells of ink, French perfume, and the soft burn of freshly waxed floors. This is not Versailles. This is Russia. And Catherine is rewriting the rules as she goes. She wasn't born royal. She wasn't even born Russian. Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, arrived in Russia at 14 to marry the awkward, toy soldier-obsessed heir to the throne, Peter III. He loved Frederick the Great. She loved books. He talked to statues. She took notes. He played with wooden regiments in bed. She quietly began planning a coup. Their marriage was cold, and not just because of the Russian winters. Peter resented her. She pitied him. While he polished figurines, Catherine read philosophy under the covers and wrote letters to Voltaire. There was no passion, no partnership, just long silences, awkward meals, and an ever-growing sense that someone had to be the adult in the room. But Catherine was not content to merely endure. She began cultivating allies, military men, ministers, nobles, and yes, lovers. Many lovers. Here's the thing, Catherine the Great had a system. Historians agree she was methodical about it. Candidates for her affection were discreetly vetted by trusted advisors, screened not just for charm, but for intelligence, loyalty, and personal hygiene. This is not a joke. She wasn't looking for flirtations. She was building alliances, personal ones, strategic ones, emotional ones, occasionally passionate ones. And yes, she kept a list. Among the most famous was Grigory Orlov, a dashing officer who helped her orchestrate the coup that removed her husband from power. When Peter III was mysteriously assassinated shortly after abdicating, no one asked too many questions. Catherine took the throne, and Orlov took a place at her side, for a while. Then came Grigory Potemkin, the man many believe was her true great love, charismatic, brilliant, slightly unhinged. They may have even married in secret. The letters between them crackle with affection, with fire, with the kind of possessiveness that rarely ends in tea and cake. Potemkin called her my soul, my little mother, my empress of the night. She responded in kind, with pet names, with political power, and with lavish gifts. They drifted apart romantically, but remained intensely close. Potemkin became her most trusted advisor, her general, her fixer. He once faked entire villages along the Dnieper River to impress foreign dignitaries, a move so audacious it birthed the phrase Potemkin Village. You almost have to admire the commitment. But back to the lovers. Catherine didn't try to hide her relationships, nor did she flaunt them. She was unapologetic. And when a relationship ended, she often arranged for the former lover to receive a title, a country estate, and a comfortable pension. Breakups were handled with more dignity than some modern text conversations. Now, about the horse. You've heard it, haven't you? That old slanderous rumor that Catherine died attempting relations with a horse. It's completely false, utterly fabricated, a misogynistic smear invented by enemies, foreign and domestic, who couldn't stand the idea of a powerful, sexually autonomous woman. Catherine didn't die under a horse. She died from a stroke in bed at 67 after ruling for over 3 decades. But the horse story, it stuck because, well, people are the worst. She once said, "I shall be an autocrat, that's my trade," but she might as well have added, and I'll do it on my own terms. You imagine her now reclining on a chaise, quill in hand, responding to yet another Enlightenment thinker with more wit than most kings could manage sober. She isn't scheming, she's organizing, reframing Russia, expanding education, rewriting laws, all while balancing a delicate, entirely curated rotation of companionship. Historians still argue whether her lovers wielded real influence or were simply ornamentation. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Potemkin, yes, he mattered, but many others were momentary comforts, part-time confidants, royal footnotes written in cologne and silk. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining the rhythm of her days, meetings, letters, affairs, power, served with chilled vodka and the occasional poem. Her court was glittering but sharp, like ice beneath diamonds. Nothing stayed warm for long, except maybe, just maybe, her memories of Potemkin. And as you step out onto a frost-covered balcony, the cold bites at your cheeks. Below, the Neva River winds slowly past palaces she filled with art and chandeliers and quiet, unread love letters. In the distance, the wind howls. But up here, the Empress sleeps on, her power intact, her past carefully managed, and her heart, well, perhaps still under review. You blink through a soft fog now, and the golden domes of St. Petersburg give way to the cool, candlelit shadows of a medieval chapel in France. The air smells of old stone and drying herbs. Outside, the torches flicker. Inside, the tension is exquisite, because tonight you are not the only one walking this narrow passage between power and passion. Here comes King Henry II of France, young, handsome, moody, and entangled in one of the most legendary royal love triangles in European history. You may want to grab a cushion for this one. There's a queen, there's a mistress, there's a whole underground tunnel system, metaphorically and possibly literally. And at the heart of it all, one woman who has outlasted gossip, generations, and time itself, Diane de Poitiers. Diane wasn't a passing fancy, she wasn't a summer scandal, she was the woman in Henry's life, his mentor, his obsession, his guide, his much older mistress. That last part, let's be clear, when they first met she was 31, he was 15, and despite what your inner history teacher is saying, they stayed together for the next 2 decades. You're walking with them now through a palace garden. He's young and jittery, recently returned from being held hostage in Spain. She's graceful, impossibly poised, and dressed in stark black and white gowns that make her look more like a chess queen than a lover. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant, politically savvy. She knew how to write, manage, charm, and survive. You almost admire her for that. Almost. Meanwhile, poor Catherine de' Medici, Henry's actual wife, is in the background, watching, waiting, biding her time like a queen in a cage. She married Henry at 14, brought an enormous dowry from the Medici banking empire, and was considered politically valuable but romantically invisible. For 10 years she was queen, in name only. Because every time Henry appeared at court, he had Diane at his side, not behind him, not in secret, at his side. She was given the title Duchess of Valentinois. She signed letters as Henri's mistress, officially. He even gave her royal properties, including the Château de Chenonceau, which you can still visit today. If walls could whisper, that place would need a volume knob. And yes, they had matching monograms, H intertwined with D, carved into furniture, ceilings, and even royal medals. Catherine, still queen, had to live beneath ceilings that literally honoured her husband's lover. You walk with Diane now through her private gardens, where she grows medicinal herbs and studies astrology. She isn't playing palace games, she's shaping policy, advising the king, coordinating the royal image. There's an intimacy here that transcends gossip. Henry doesn't just love her. He trusts her in a way that defies his role, his age, and the expectations of every powdered noble breathing in their corsets. But time, of course, has no patience for romance. Henry dies suddenly in 1559 during a jousting tournament, no less, when a lance splinters and pierces his eye. You wince now, watching it happen in your imagination. Catherine rushes to his side. Diane is banned from the room. Catherine finally seizes her moment, not with rage, but with absolute precision. Diane is stripped of titles, forced to return the Château de Chenonceau. Her monogram is chiselled off walls. Catherine takes over as regent of France, and everything Diane once touched is repainted, retitled, rewritten. It's not revenge, it's erasure. Cold, clinical, perfectly executed. And yet, even Catherine preserved some of Diane's personal letters, as if part of her knew that history would be curious, that history would want to ask, was it love? Was it control? Was it a young king searching for confidence in the arms of an older woman who knew the world better than he did? Historians still argue whether Diane truly loved him or simply played the role perfectly. There's no clear answer, but what's certain is that she never married again. She retired quietly, died peacefully, and was buried with dignity. Her portrait remained in Henry's chambers until the day he died. Catherine, for all her fury, never fully removed her rival's ghost. Tonight, you slip between the pages of this strange triangle, one filled with duty, power, and longing. Diane, the mistress who outshone queens. Catherine, the queen who outlived kings. And Henry, the man who left his heart engraved in more than just stone. You rest beneath the ceiling where their initials once intertwined, and wonder if love ever really dies, or just changes hands. You exhale into the hush of a Spanish palace now, one where the stone walls seem to sigh with centuries of restraint. The fire crackles low, barely offering warmth. The curtains are thick, but not for decoration. They're for privacy. Because you've entered the cold, echoing world of Philip II of Spain, and let's just say, passion wasn't his strong suit. Philip was in many ways a king of contradictions. He ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, lands across Europe, the Americas, even the Philippines were named after him. And yet, in private, he was profoundly reserved, solemn, silent, devoted more to paperwork than pleasure. The kind of man who probably apologized to his robe before putting it on. You catch a glimpse of him now in the corner of a firelit study, slender, pale, with a Habsburg jaw you could use to crack almonds. He's hunched over dispatches, correcting reports in the margins. He's writing to viceroys, not valentines. And yet this man married 4 times, yes, 4. But don't get too excited. This is not a tale of romantic entanglements. This is a slow burn of dynastic duty, religious piety, and one man's uncomfortable habit of falling in love with political requirements. His first wife? Maria Manuela of Portugal, his cousin. She was 16, he was 16. Their union was brief, tragic, and childbearing. She died shortly after giving birth to Don Carlos, who, spoiler, turned out to be a deeply troubled son. You'll meet him again in a moment. Next came Mary I of England. Yes, Bloody Mary herself. Theirs was a political alliance designed to unite Catholic powers against Protestantism. He was 27, she was 37. Their wedding was sombre, filled with protocol and awkward glances. Philip barely spoke English, Mary barely smiled. He stayed in England for a short time, then left, never to return. She wrote him loving letters. He replied diplomatically. They never had children. Mary died heartbroken. Philip barely paused before scanning Europe for another bride. His third marriage to Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of the King of France, is the only one that offered glimpses, just glimpses, of warmth. She was elegant, artistic, and 14 when they married. He was 32, and yet, by all accounts, this was the closest Philip ever came to emotional intimacy. She made him laugh. She challenged his stiffness with her French charm. There's a record of him joining her for poetry readings, for music, for garden walks. But tragedy, as usual, was waiting just around the tapestried corner. Elizabeth died in childbirth at 23. Philip mourned her. Genuinely, he wore black for months, refused to remarry for a while. Some say he never smiled the same way again. But there was still empire to manage, and dynasties don't expand themselves, so he married a 4th time, Anna of Austria, his niece. Yes, his niece. This was, to no one's surprise, more about bloodlines than bonding. She bore him several children, including the future Philip III, who would eventually inherit the throne. But now, let's return to Don Carlos, his firstborn, the child of two close cousins, intelligent, volatile, possibly paranoid. He once attempted to stab a servant for dressing too slowly. At another point, he tried to flee Spain and join the enemy army. He starved himself. He may have attempted to push someone down the stairs. Philip, increasingly desperate and alarmed, imprisoned his own son. Don Carlos died 6 months later under mysterious circumstances. Some say illness, others say poison. Philip never admitted anything, but the whispers have never really stopped. Even centuries later, historians still argue whether Don Carlos was a victim of royal cruelty, untreated mental illness, or both. Philip, for his part, retreated deeper into silence. His courtiers often described him as a statue of stone. He rarely laughed, rarely spoke. Yet he ruled meticulously, sometimes reading every single piece of mail that crossed his desk. Thousands. In his later years, he moved into the monastery of El Escorial, a sprawling granite complex that looks less like a palace and more like a penitentiary designed by an architect in mourning. There, Philip died in 1598, alone, suffering from gout, consumed by ulcers, and, according to those who saw him, spiritually exhausted. He died with a crucifix in his hand, a king who had loved often but never deeply, who married again and again, but never quite stepped into the warmth of the marriages he arranged. And so you sit now in El Escorial, wrapped in the same chill that settled into his bones. The walls are quiet, the candles low, and you wonder whether Philip ever let himself feel truly close to anyone, or whether his sense of duty had simply left no room. Some hearts are kept not in cages, but in archives, neatly labelled, filed, never opened again. You exhale into the misty candlelight of Tudor England once more. Only this time, the throne is colder, the tapestries more faded, and the whispers sharper. You're drifting through the quieter corridors of a court that still carries the scent of intrigue, sweat, and damp wool. And tonight, you follow the secretive footsteps of two royal sisters, Mary I and Elizabeth of Armby. The Tudor sisters were queens, yes, but they were also women, born into a royal family where love was a luxury, and men were often the key to your survival or your downfall. Their romantic lives, tangled and tightly guarded, remain some of the most debated and delicious mysteries in European royal history. Let's begin with Mary I, the Elder, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, devoutly Catholic, gravely serious, scarred by childhood instability and her father's multiple annulments, beheadings and spontaneous wife upgrades. She spent much of her youth cast aside, declared illegitimate, and wondering whether affection ever truly survived in royal halls. When she finally came to the throne at age 37, her personal life was far from triumphant. She had no close companions, no romantic past, and then, like a thunderclap in a cathedral, she married Philip II of Spain. Yes, that Philip, the very one you just met. He was 11 years younger. Her cousin, a political union brokered through treaties, not candlelit glances. Mary adored him, wrote to him, longed for him, but Philip treated her like a valuable trade route, useful, temporary, distant. He spent more time away than with her, and when he did write, his letters were filled with phrases like obligation and divine purpose. Not exactly bedtime poetry. She believed she was pregnant, twice, but both times turned out to be phantom pregnancies, likely the result of extreme stress, illness, or hormonal imbalance. Her heart broke quietly. Her hope withered publicly. She died childless and heart-heavy, convinced that she had failed both her people and her God. And yet, even in her loneliness, there's something poignant about her yearning. Mary didn't crave luxury, she craved closeness. She wanted the simplest thing no one ever taught her how to receive, affection. But then came Elizabeth. You know her already. The Virgin Queen, the myth, the icon. But when you step back into her world now, you're not standing in a myth. You're crouched in the velvet shadows of a woman constantly watching her back. Elizabeth saw what marriage did to women. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had her head chopped off for being too alluring. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, suffered the same fate. Elizabeth learned early that to be loved in court often meant to be destroyed by it, so she never married. Officially. But unofficially, the story deepens. You know about Robert Dudley already, her lifelong companion. The man whose bedchamber was famously close to hers, the one whose wife died mysteriously, down a staircase no less, leading to decades of speculation and scandal. You've stood in their long, aching glances already. But Dudley wasn't the only one. There was also Christopher Hatton, a courtier with a flair for dance and flattery. Elizabeth called him Lids, short for her little eyes. She once told him, "If you were a man of my family, I would make you my husband." He reportedly blushed for 3 days. And then there was Walter Raleigh, the dashing explorer who tried to flirt with her through poetry and exotic gifts. He did quite well until he secretly married one of her maids and was promptly thrown in the Tower. Elizabeth did not take betrayal lightly, but perhaps the most interesting man in her life came later. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Young, bold, reckless. He was nearly 30 years younger than her, and their relationship was fiery in every direction. He once burst into her chamber before she'd put on her makeup. She reportedly slapped him across the face in public. Later, he led a failed rebellion and was executed. Elizabeth signed the death warrant herself, then fell into a deep depression. Some historians suggest she loved him. Others argue he simply reminded her of a youth she could no longer afford to chase. Either way, the ache lingered, and yet she remained unmarried. Historians still argue why. Was it strategy, trauma, pride, asexuality? Was she truly uninterested in men, or simply terrified of the political implications of choosing the wrong one? Elizabeth once said, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." It was a clever line. It was also heartbreak, folded into a crown. You sit now beside the empty throne in her private chamber. Her famous red wig lies on a stand. Her jewels are set neatly in velvet. And yet there is no ring, no love letter, just a ruler's lonely shadow stretching long into the evening. The Tudor sisters each held a throne, each ruled alone. One sought love and found sorrow. The other refused love and found solitude. And both, in their own way, were trapped by the expectations of their blood. You close your eyes now, listening to the soft whisper of a silk gown trailing across old stone. Perhaps it's Mary, perhaps Elizabeth, perhaps both, still waiting for a kind word that never quite came. You open your eyes to silence, true silence. Not the awkward stillness of court, not the whispering corridors of palaces, but the vast and orderly quiet of Prussia. You are in the presence of Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, commander of armies, patron of the arts, composer of flute sonatas, and a man who had very little time or patience for women. The air is crisp here, almost surgical. His palace, Sanssouci, feels more like a study than a home. Everything is symmetrical, controlled, uncluttered. It's a kingdom of sharp angles, fluted columns, and parquet floors polished with obsessive intensity. And somewhere in the center of it all, you find Frederick, writing, composing, rewriting, marching, always marching. Born in 1712, Frederick had what can only be described as a violent childhood. His father, Frederick William the Fiefdom, was a strict militarist who thought music was nonsense, books were dangerous, and affection was a sign of weakness. Frederick, on the other hand, adored literature, philosophy, and his flute. You watch a scene unfold. A young Frederick caught reading French poetry. His father bursts in. The book is ripped from his hands. He's beaten. Another day, he's dragged to witness executions, forced to attend military drills for hours on end. At one point, he tries to flee, with a male companion, no less. They're caught. Frederick is imprisoned. His friend is executed in front of him. Historians still debate whether this trauma shaped Frederick's lifelong emotional detachment or whether he was simply wired differently from the start. But one thing's clear, Frederick never truly loved a woman. He did marry, once, briefly, to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a woman he described as brainless and insipid. It was a political union arranged by his father. Frederick avoided her at every opportunity. He refused to live with her even after becoming king. He placed her in a separate palace and visited only on formal occasions. Once he said, "I shall never consummate the marriage. The thought revolts me." You glance around his private study. No portraits of her, no poems dedicated, no children, not even an awkward letter, just shelves of Voltaire, papers of battle formations, and that ever-present flute. But now a different name drifts through the quiet. Hans Hermann von Katte. That was the friend, perhaps more, who helped Frederick attempt his escape as a teenager. They shared rooms, they wrote affectionate letters. Some historians describe them as inseparable. Others, more cautiously, note the tone of their writing was unusually tender. When Katte was executed, Frederick reportedly collapsed. He wept for days. Something in him shattered. Something never quite healed. Later in life, Frederick surrounded himself with men. His inner circle was almost exclusively male. He wrote long letters to men, held court with male philosophers, invited military companions to live with him at Sanssouci. He once said, "A king should avoid all women. They only bring disorder." And then there's Voltaire, the French philosopher and wit who shared an intense, tumultuous friendship with Frederick. They exchanged hundreds of letters, passionate, funny, biting. Frederick called him my soul's companion. Voltaire called him my philosopher king. They even lived together briefly at Sanssouci. It ended in an argument, as genius pairings often do, but the bond left its mark. You sit now in the garden outside his study. Frederick walks alone, hands clasped behind his back, head bent in thought. He's not thinking of romance. He's planning another maneuver, another symphony, another essay on governance. But does that mean he never loved? Or did he simply love in a way the 18th century couldn't understand or allow? Historians still argue. Some label him asexual. Others suggest he was a gay man forced into denial by duty and decorum. Others insist he simply didn't care for intimacy at all, that power was his only true companion. The truth, like so many shadows in candlelit corridors, flickers just out of reach. When Frederick died in 1786, he requested to be buried next to his dogs, not his wife. For years, his wishes were ignored, but eventually his remains were moved. Today, on a quiet hill in Potsdam, he rests under a modest stone with a single inscription, Frederick the Great. There are no love letters buried with him, no descendants, no statues of a queen, just a flute, a sword, and a silence deeper than most kings could bear. You walk away from Sanssouci slowly, the gravel path crunching underfoot. And you wonder, not every king needed a queen. But every human longs for someone, don't they? Even the great ones. You step lightly now into a room where the curtains never quite open, and the air smells faintly of lavender and morning oil. The fire burns low but never goes out. This is not a palace, it's a shrine. And at its center sits Queen Victoria, draped in black, wrapped in memory, and still very much in love with a man who has been dead for decades. You're in Windsor Castle, but you might as well be in a mausoleum with wallpaper, because for Queen Victoria, love didn't end at death. It simply shifted shape, moved into shadows, and followed her from room to room for the rest of her life. It began, as these stories often do, with an arranged marriage. But this time, it worked. Victoria met Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha when she was 17. They were cousins, because of course they were, but something was different. He was thoughtful, quiet, serious. She was impulsive, sharp-tongued, and already queen. He wore flannel, she wore a crown. And yet she fell for him immediately. He didn't propose. She did. They married in 1840. 9 children later, their union had become more than political. It was partnership, love, passion even. Victoria was not shy about her feelings. In her diary, she described their wedding night in detail, so affectionate it could make a historian blush. "Too delightful," she wrote. "Oh, this was the happiest day of my life." Albert became not just her husband, but her confidant, her advisor, her anchor. He helped modernize the monarchy, supported the arts, and gently tried to trim some of Victoria's more dramatic tendencies, which, to be fair, were frequent and spectacular. She adored him, relied on him, called him her angel. And then, in 1861, after just 21 years of marriage, he died. Typhoid fever, or possibly Crohn's disease, historians still debate the exact cause, but the effect, catastrophic. Victoria was undone. She wore black for the rest of her life. That's not poetic exaggeration. She literally never wore colour again. She withdrew from public life, refused to open Parliament, refused to attend state occasions. Ministers were forced to hold meetings in her bedroom because she couldn't bear to leave it. England joked about her becoming the widow of Windsor. But behind the ridicule was something quietly heartbreaking. She kept Albert's dressing gown laid out each morning, his shaving kit cleaned and polished. A servant brought hot water to his room every day as if he might still use it. She even had a plaster cast made of his hand, so she could hold it at night. And yet, even in grief, she was not alone. Enter John Brown, a Scottish servant who had worked for Albert and was fiercely loyal to the Queen. After Albert's death, Brown became her personal attendant and her emotional lifeline. He was blunt, gruff, and called her woman when she was being difficult. She adored him. Rumours flew. Did they have an affair? Did they marry in secret? Was he just a friend or something more? Victoria had him by her side constantly. She had portraits painted of him. She had medals struck in his honour. When he died, she mourned him deeply, almost as deeply as Albert. Historians still argue. Some believe it was romantic, others think it was an emotional dependency born from loneliness. A few whisper that they shared a bed. More believe she simply loved him, the way grieving people sometimes cling to the only person who still feels real. Later in life, another man would appear, Abdul Karim, a young Indian servant who rose rapidly to become her munshi or teacher. He taught her Urdu, brought her gifts from India, and once again became her emotional focus. The court was scandalized, her children were furious, but Victoria insisted he be treated with respect. She dined with him, walked with him, trusted him. Another emotional bond, another thread in a queen's long tapestry of grief and affection. Victoria ruled for over 63 years, but after Albert's death, she never truly smiled again in the way she once had. When she died in 1901, she requested to be buried with Albert's dressing gown, a lock of John Brown's hair, and a photograph of Abdul Karim. All three men, husband, companion, confidant, lay close to her, even in the grave. You step back now from her quiet chamber, the air heavy with memory. The bed is empty, the candles low, but the room aches with love, unresolved, undimmed. And you wonder, as you turn away, was Victoria's life one long mourning dress? Or was it the love itself that kept her alive all those years, etched into every seam of her black silk gown? Love didn't leave her. Not really. It just changed outfits. Now the frost on Windsor's windows melts into something harsher, louder. You're no longer wrapped in layers of lace and grief. You're stumbling, frankly, into a room that smells like sweat, vodka, wet fur, and something recently set on fire. You've arrived in the court of Peter the Great, Tsar, reformer, occasional dentist, an absolute whirlwind of a human being. If Queen Victoria mourned her husband like a saint in velvet, Peter mourned absolutely nothing, least of all decorum. Born in 1672, Peter towered over most of his subjects, physically and otherwise. He was nearly 7 feet tall, full of energy, constantly in motion. You get the sense, even just watching him across a cluttered workshop, that he would have taken apart the entire universe just to see how it worked. And when it came to love, well, chaotic neutral doesn't even begin to cover it. Peter married twice, but that barely scratches the surface. His first wife was Eudoxia Lopukina, a noblewoman chosen by his mother. She was devout, traditional, and very much not Peter's vibe. He tried, briefly, but by age 25 he had locked her away in a convent. Not metaphorically, literally. She remained there for decades. Their son, Alexei, grew up caught between his mother's piety and his father's unpredictability, and things did not end well for him, but we'll get there in a minute, because now your candlelight flickers across the face of Catherine the Founted, his second wife, and one of the most unlikely empresses in Russian history. She began life as a Lithuanian peasant. Some sources say she was a servant, others a war prisoner. Somehow, through pure resilience and probably a significant amount of luck, she caught Peter's eye. And unlike Eudoxia, Catherine got him. She didn't flinch when he ranted. She didn't run when he hurled furniture. She stood beside him on military campaigns, helped him bathe after battles, and once, famously, calmed him during a near-fatal rage by simply handing him a glass of vodka and sitting down without blinking. They married in secret first, then publicly in 1712. By then she had already borne him several children. She wasn't educated, but she was smart, brilliant even, in the ways that mattered to Peter. She listened, advised, and soothed him. He once said, without her, I would be lost. But this isn't a tidy love story. It's messy, it's muddy. It's 3 a.m. in a freezing military tent, Catherine handing Peter a plate of pickled herring while he drafts new naval codes with one hand and pulls a tooth with the other. He performed impromptu dentistry. He thought it was relaxing, for him. And then there's the Lefortovo affair. Peter had a notorious soft spot for Alexander Menshikov, his childhood friend turned advisor turned co-conspirator in everything from palace renovations to impromptu masquerade balls. Their closeness raised eyebrows. Letters between them, while not overtly romantic, were deeply emotional, intimate even. Menshikov lived in the palace, dined with the family, and shared in nearly every major decision Peter made. Historians still argue whether their relationship crossed into romantic or simply remained a lifelong, codependent bromance of the highest order. And if you're wondering whether Peter was faithful to Catherine, adoring Catherine, the answer is not particularly. He had lovers. Many. At one point, he maintained a personal amusement court, a collection of clowns, entertainers, and women who served no official role other than to make him laugh and, well, let's say the job description was flexible. Catherine tolerated it all. She had to. Power was precarious, and Peter's moods were unpredictable as the Baltic wind. Still, when Peter grew ill in 1725, it was Catherine he leaned on. She remained at his side until the very end. And when he died, possibly from a bladder infection, possibly from sheer exhaustion, she wept. But then, astonishingly, she ruled. Catherine became the first woman to ascend the Russian throne in her own right. A former servant, now empress. And now we return briefly to Peter's son by Eudoxia, Alexei. Father and son had a toxic, tragic relationship. Alexei wanted a quiet life. Peter wanted a warrior. When Alexei was caught conspiring with his mother and political enemies, Peter tortured him. And yes, he died, possibly executed, possibly broken by interrogation. To this day, historians disagree on whether Peter ordered his death or simply let the system crush him. It was one of the few times Catherine disagreed with him, quietly, carefully, lovingly. And perhaps that is the truest love in Peter's life, not in ballads or formal portraits, but in the quiet endurance of Catherine, who stayed, soothed, and survived him. You leave the smoky room now, your boots crunching over broken glass from a banquet no one finished cleaning up. Peter's court never really slept, and neither did his passions. In the distance, you hear the soft sound of a flute, badly played but earnest. Catherine's voice hums beneath it, and the wind carries both away. You wander now through the satin-draped corridors of 18th century France, where every breath seems steeped in perfume and powdered sugar. But don't be fooled. Beneath the lace and waltzes, this place runs on secrets, and tonight you're standing just outside the doors of a chamber where three royal brothers shared more than just a bloodline. They shared mistresses. Welcome to the world of the Bourbon brothers, where titles were traded like favors and lovers passed from king to count like a particularly elegant game of musical chairs. You're here for the sons of Louis XIII, but more specifically, the one who became Louis XV, known later as Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, though history would grow less fond with time. And his younger cousins and siblings, they played no small role in the tapestry of royal passion either. Let's start with Louis XV himself. He came to the throne as a boy, shy, bookish, raised in the shadow of his great-grandfather, the Sun King. Everyone expected moderation, modesty, stability. And for a while, that's what they got. He married Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess known for her gentleness and piety. She bore him 10 children, yes, 10, and smiled patiently through the early years of his reign. But as the years wore on and the pressures of the crown grew heavy, Louis turned elsewhere. By elsewhere, we mean an entire wing of Versailles discreetly dedicated to his ever-evolving parade of mistresses. The most famous, Madame de Pompadour. Intelligent, witty, a commoner, and, despite popular belief, not his lover for long. After the physical side of their relationship faded, she remained his closest advisor, his confidant, his stylist, his art curator, and occasional political whisperer. They even coordinated who his next lovers should be. Yes, together. You lean against the panelled wall of Versailles now, listening as whispers pass down the corridor. He's found another girl. Pompadour approved her. She's barely 15. Yes, that happened more than once. Eventually, the king grew more withdrawn, more paranoid, and more obsessed with youth and beauty. That's when he created Le Parc aux Cerfs, a secret pleasure house near the palace where young women were installed, rotated, and dismissed with generous pensions. The system was methodical, frighteningly so. And yes, historians still argue how much Louis XV truly understood, or wanted to understand, the implications of what he'd created. Meanwhile, enter his cousins and brothers, who saw no reason to let the king have all the fun. His cousin Louis, Count of Provence, and brother Charles-Philippe, who would later become Louis XVIII and Charles d'Arques, weren't exactly known for discretion. They threw lavish parties, maintained competing stables of mistresses, swapped courtesans between them with the ease of borrowing a riding jacket. One particularly infamous story features a woman named Mademoiselle de Romans, who was passed between brothers, lavished with gifts, and then abandoned when one of them developed a sudden preference for Italian opera singers. She went on to write thinly veiled memoirs. Spiteful? Maybe. Enlightening? Definitely. And if you're wondering whether this tangled web ever got messy, oh, it absolutely did. There were jealous duels, anonymous pamphlets, an entire underground economy of whispers, fan signals, and poisoned pastries. At court, everyone pretended not to notice. That was the code. You smiled, you bowed. You handed off your former mistress with a gracious nod and perhaps a diamond bracelet. Yet among the Bourbon brothers, only Louis XV seemed to genuinely struggle with guilt. He began to withdraw in his later years, especially after the death of Madame de Pompadour. His next favourite, Madame du Barry, was young, lively, and politically clueless. She wasn't interested in poetry or policy, just luxury. Louis loved her anyway, until the revolution swept her away. Because yes, this glittering carousel of flirtation, it spun straight into catastrophe. When the French Revolution erupted, one of the many grievances flung at the monarchy was its decadence, the mistresses, the spending, the separation between palace and people, the lovers' wings, the pension lists. Even Madame du Barry was dragged to the guillotine. And the Bourbon brothers? Some fled, some fought, some tried to pretend it had all been a dream. Spoiler, it hadn't. You sit now on a carved bench near a closed doorway. A letter lies beside you, unsigned, sweetly folded, stained with perfume and sealed with wax. Was it for the king, for his brother, for both? No one remembers. Because that was the way of the Bourbon court. Love wasn't written in stone. It was passed between hands like a secret, shared, shelved, forgotten, or remembered by someone somewhere in the quiet long after the candles had burned down. And now the hall is empty, and the bench is cold, and the letter waits, unopened. You step gently now into the muffled hush of a royal court with the curtains half drawn and the voices lowered to whispers. The sunlight doesn't quite reach here, filtered as it is through layers of heavy drapery and even heavier restraint. This is 17th century France, and the queen you've come to meet is Anne of Austria. She isn't dancing, she isn't laughing, she is sitting quietly, composed in posture and expression, a living portrait of royal solemnity. But beneath the satin and the rosary beads, longing, silence, and a marriage colder than the marble floors beneath your feet. Anne of Austria, Spanish by birth, French by marriage, was queen consort to Louis XIII, a man whose romantic reputation could be summarized in one word: frosty. This was not the grand romance of fairy tales. It was difficult, strained, half a lifetime of missed glances and clipped phrases. They married in 1615, both 15 years old, both royal, both raised in worlds where duty eclipsed desire. The ceremony was grand, the public adoration staged, but behind closed doors, the connection just never came. Anne was vibrant, cultured, fluent in multiple languages. Louis was shy, pious, distant, and more at ease with dogs and hunting horns than with conversation, and that made for a very, very quiet bedroom. Years passed. No air, no joy. Rumours bloomed like mould in the corners of Versailles. Was Louis incapable? Was Anne too cold? Were they even sharing a chamber anymore? At one point, their failure to produce children for over 20 years led to serious political anxiety. France needed a dauphin, courtiers held their breath, ministers plotted alternate succession plans. The Queen prayed, the King paced. And then, suddenly, at age 37, Anne became pregnant, twice. She gave birth to the future Louis XIV, then to another son, Philippe, Duke of Orléans. The nation exhaled, the dynasty was saved, but even this miracle was draped in mystery, because historians still argue how it happened. One theory suggests a rare thunderstorm forced the king and queen to spend a night together. Pure coincidence. Another proposes the queen prayed at the tomb of Saint Fiacre, a fertility saint, and voila, success. A third theory, whispered, speculative, hints that the child might not have been Louis' at all, that perhaps another man visited Anne's chamber, unseen, unspoken, but there's no proof, only silence. Meanwhile, Louis XIII, despite being a king, seemed disinterested in romantic companionship altogether. He maintained close relationships with a series of male favourites, including Charles d'Albert, Duke of Luynes, and later Henri Coiffier de Rouzay, Marquis of Cinq-Mars, a young courtier who became unusually powerful and unusually close to the king. Letters between them reveal deep affection, sometimes bordering on the poetic. "Without you," Louis once wrote, "my soul is lonely." Were they lovers? Some scholars say yes. Others insist the king was simply a man of fragile emotion and rare connection. The truth, as always, lies between the lines. And Anne? She endured. She played the role of queen with grace. She navigated the treacherous waters of French politics, the religious tension, and the ever-hovering shadow of Cardinal Richelieu, the king's chief minister and unofficial emotional surrogate. Anne and Richelieu despised one another, a slow-burning war fought with couriers and court alliances. But when Louis XIII died in 1643, everything changed. Anne became regent for her son, young Louis XIV, and suddenly the quiet queen found her voice. With the help of Cardinal Mazarin, she ruled France during a turbulent period known as the Fronde, a civil uprising of nobles against royal authority. And now, once again, whispers. Because Anne and Mazarin were close, very close. He was her advisor, her protector, her constant companion. Some say he was also her lover, Others claim they married in secret. Still others insist it was a deep friendship born of mutual reliance and impossible loneliness. No love letters survive, only gestures, the kind that say more than ink ever could. Anne outlived both her husband and Mazarin. She retired from politics, donned simpler gowns, attended Mass daily, and spent her last years in quiet reflection, finally free of the cold silences that had defined her marriage. You sit now in a window seat overlooking a private garden, once trimmed to perfection for a queen who waited decades for warmth. The roses still bloom, soft, cautious, faintly perfumed. And somewhere beyond the hedges the wind carries a name that was never spoken aloud in public, only whispered in the safety of drawn curtains, a name not meant for history books, but held close in the space where memory refuses to fade. You glide now through a passage not marked on any official floor plan, lit by sconces that flicker just enough to suggest something mischievous has just happened, and might happen again. You're at the heart of the 17th century French court, but not in the King's Wing. No, tonight you follow the scent of ambergris and scandal to the gilded apartments of the Duke of Orléans, known simply as Monsieur. He is Philippe, younger brother to Louis XIV, and he is not here to play second fiddle quietly. Where Louis is the Sun King, burning, central, surrounded by gravity, Philippe is a moon of a different hue, flashier, moodier, and always adorned with a truly outrageous number of jewels. You find him now reclining on a velvet chaise, fan in one hand, gossip in the other. His outfit lavender silk, his heels high enough to qualify as architectural achievements, his hair perfect, always. He is surrounded by mirrors and admirers. Monsieur was known for many things, bravery in battle, sharp wit, a flair for drama, but above all, he was known for his male companions, whom everyone at court referred to with theatrical vagueness as his favourites. The most infamous of them all, Philippe de Lorraine, the Chevalier de Lorraine, tall, handsome, absolutely ruthless. He wasn't just a lover, he was a manipulator, a political schemer, a master of navigating the razor-thin ice of court favour. And Philippe, our Duke, was obsessed with him. Their relationship spanned years full of passion, jealousy, banishment, reconciliation, and more jewellery than most royal weddings. Louis XIV despised the Chevalier, banished him multiple times. But each time Philippe begged for his return, sometimes refusing to eat or attend court until his beloved was back by his side. And back he came. Now, before you paint this as a courtly Romeo and Juliet, remember this was also messy, because while Monsieur adored his Chevalier, he was also required, by law, tradition, and his older brother's iron will, to marry twice. His first wife, Henrietta of England, known as Minette, was clever, cultured, and painfully aware of her husband's preference for velvet doublets and gentlemen's fencing salons. Their marriage was strained. She wrote letters. He threw parties without her. They argued famously and loudly, but then she died, mysteriously, at the age of 26 after collapsing at a dinner party. The official cause? A perforated ulcer. The court's whisper? Poison. Eyes turned immediately to the Chevalier de Lorraine, who had recently been exiled by Louis and likely wasn't thrilled about it. No proof was ever found, of course, but in Versailles, truth was often just another costume. Philippe remarried, this time to Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, a German princess with little patience for court games and even less tolerance for her husband's nighttime visitors. Their letters, hundreds of them, reveal a curious dynamic, blunt honesty. She wrote openly about Philippe's relationships with men. He confessed, she complained, he shrugged. Somehow, they made it work. They had children, they performed their royal duties, and in private, they mostly lived separate lives. And yet, Philippe was not just a scandalous brother in eyeliner, he was a skilled general. He fought bravely at the Battle of Cassel and proved his military worth, even as some mocked him for his flamboyance. Louis, ever the spotlight hoarder, grew uncomfortable with his brother's success and subtly pulled him back into court theatrics rather than campaigns. "You can be brilliant," Louis seemed to say, "just not more brilliant than me." So Philippe returned to his salons, his fans, his labyrinth of mirrors, but he never really left his mark in history's official pages, because kings write the history books, and Philippe was always too busy living in the footnotes. Still, the court remembered him, and the people, they loved to watch. He was unapologetically himself in a time when being anything other than scripted nobility could be dangerous. He wore pearls to council meetings, he brought men to royal ceremonies, he commissioned paintings of himself in armour and rouge, and when confronted he simply smiled and said, "I am my brother's brother, he can explain me." When Philippe died in 1701, his legacy was complicated. He'd been a loyal subject, a problematic husband, a protective father, a military mind, and a defiant romantic. He never denied who he was. He never tried to bend into someone else's mould. And now you linger in the hallway outside his favourite mirrored gallery. The candles have burned low. The floor is silent. But if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the rustle of silk, the soft click of jewelled heels, and one last laugh just under the breath, echoing behind you. Tonight, your footsteps take you further back, deeper into time and deeper into the stone-etched legacy of a woman who was once both queen and prisoner, both wife and warrior. You step across the threshold of a castle where the torches flicker just a little longer when her name is spoken. You are walking in the shadow of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Few names in European royalty carry the sheer weight that hers does: Queen of France, then Queen of England, Mother of Kings, Crusader, patron of poets. But most of all, Eleanor was a woman who refused to be forgotten, especially by the men who tried. And she was loved by two kings. First came Louis VII of France, pious, awkward, deeply religious, and almost hilariously unsuited for someone like Eleanor. She was raised in the glittering court of Aquitaine, surrounded by troubadours, philosophy, sensual poetry, and an atmosphere where cleverness was as prized as virtue. Louis, on the other hand, was training to be a monk before unexpectedly becoming king. It was a bit like marrying a harp to a hammer. Still, they were wed in 1137. She was 15, he was 17, and France watched in fascinated silence. Eleanor tried. She truly did. She followed him on the Second Crusade, riding through blistering heat in full armour, navigating the politics of Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem, not as a silent consort, but as a figure of influence. There were rumours, of course there were rumours, that she had an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, a dashing, charismatic prince. She stayed in Antioch longer than Louis liked. He demanded she leave. She refused. Eventually she relented, but the marriage never recovered. When they returned to France, she petitioned for an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, the classic royal fallback. They were too closely related, she argued, which, if you've been paying attention, is hilarious considering how many monarchs married their cousins without blinking, but it worked. The Pope agreed. The marriage was dissolved, and Eleanor? She didn't return quietly to a nunnery. She remarried, quickly, strategically, and this time for power. She married Henry Plantagenet, soon to become Henry II of England. He was 11 years her junior, bold, mercurial, ambitious. Their union combined her vast lands of Aquitaine with his rising English kingdom, creating a political powerhouse and a marriage made of fire and flint. They had 8 children, including the future Richard the Lionheart and King John. Yes, that King John, the one with the Magna Carta and a less-than-glowing review in every Robin Hood story. But their passion, it burned hot and fast. Eleanor and Henry were both strong-willed, brilliant, and deeply unwilling to play the role of the submissive spouse. He had affairs, many, most notably, with Rosamond Clifford, the fair Rosamond, whom he reportedly hid in a secret garden, away from Eleanor's wrath. Legend says she discovered the affair and offered Rosamond a choice between a dagger or poison. That's probably apocryphal, but it feels true, doesn't it? Eventually Eleanor rebelled, literally. She encouraged her sons to rise up against their father in a rebellion. She was caught, arrested, imprisoned for 16 years. Yes, imagine that. Queen of England, mother of the king's heirs, locked away in a succession of damp castles, writing letters, brooding in silence and waiting. But she outlived Henry. And when he died in 1189, Richard I became king, and one of his first acts was to release his mother. Eleanor returned to court in full force, acting as regent while Richard went off crusading. She arranged marriages, brokered peace treaties, even personally travelled across Europe to rescue her grandson from captivity. By this point she was in her 70s, still sharp, still travelling by horseback, still feared. And when she finally withdrew from court life, she didn't fade. She entered the abbey of Fontevraud, where she would eventually be buried alongside both of her royal husbands. Yes, both, one on each side, Louis of France and Henry of England. She rests between them in effigy, hands folded in eternal prayer, lips composed, gaze forward, not toward either man, but toward something entirely her own. And you wonder, as you sit on the cold stone beside her tomb, who did she love more? Historians still argue. Some say she loved Louis's idealism, Henry's passion, her son's ambition. Others say Eleanor's greatest love was not a man at all, but her freedom, her voice, her legend. She was married off, locked up, forgotten, and still she ruled, with wit, with poetry, with absolute, defiant brilliance. And as the moon rises through the ancient stained glass of the abbey, you imagine her laughing softly at all the men who tried to tame her. None ever did. The echo of Eleanor's laughter fades behind you, replaced now by the curious hush of a velvet-draped drawing room where the curtains have been pulled too tightly and the portraits all seem to glance the other way. You're in early 20th century Spain now, a kingdom on the brink, a monarchy in decline, and a palace filled with whispered rumours that sound more like the opening scenes of a particularly scandalous film. Because tonight you're meeting Alfonso III, Spain's last full reigning monarch before everything unravelled, and discovering a royal love life so unconventional that it came with a filmography. No, really. Alfonso III was born in 1886 and technically became king at birth. His father had died before he was even born. That's right. He inherited the throne in utero, a powerful star, you might think. But his reign would be anything but smooth. You first meet him as a dashing young man with a penchant for military uniforms and dramatic entrances. He was tall, charismatic, and publicly devout. Privately, a rolling storm of contradictions. He was interested in politics, yes, but even more interested in pleasure, and not the garden variety royal flirting we've come to expect. No, Alfonso had cinematic ambitions. Let's back up for a moment. In 1906, he married Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Elegant, graceful, Anglo-Protestant. The Spanish court was sceptical. The Pope was frowning. The people were unimpressed. But Alfonso didn't care. She was beautiful, intelligent, and, importantly, willing. The wedding day itself was almost cut short by a bomb, an assassination attempt that left dozens dead but spared the royal couple. A spectacularly grim omen for a marriage that would prove deeply strained. Victoria Eugenie carried hemophilia, a genetic disease passed through the royal bloodline. 2 of their sons inherited it. 1 died young. Alfonso blamed her. Their marriage soured quickly, public smiles, private bitterness, separate bedrooms, separate lives, which brings us back to the films. Alfonso III had a private interest in early cinema. He funded film projects, he collected reels, but not just any films, he collected pornography, and not just collected, he commissioned under pseudonyms, using private money, often employing Spanish film crews to create silent black and white adult films set in vaguely historical or comedic contexts. These weren't secret hobby tapes, these were scripted, costumed, sometimes artistically ambitious, royal smut. The Spanish monarchy was producing underground erotica decades before most nations even had a functioning film board. It's one of the most bizarre and eyebrow-raising chapters in royal history, and somehow true. You're probably sitting there, blinking, fair. Most people don't expect the phrase royal adult cinema to appear in their history lectures, but the tapes were real, hidden, forgotten, then discovered in an archive almost a century later. in a locked cabinet labelled vaguely as materials not suitable for public viewing. Archivists, bless them, have a sense of humour. Alfonso didn't stop there. He maintained a long list of mistresses, some actresses, some aristocrats, many unknown to history. He was known to slip away from formal events for impromptu visits to private apartments. Some say he had as many as a dozen illegitimate children. Others claim more. One mistress in particular, Melanie de Portales, was said to have wielded political influence from her salon in Paris. Another, a dancer named Carmen Ruiz Moragas, bore him 2 children and was quietly supported by royal funds. For decades, Alfonso rarely denied these affairs. He simply compartmentalized them. Wife here, children there, romance everywhere else. You pause now beside a velvet chair in his private study. It smells of pipe tobacco and worn leather. A projector sits quietly in the corner. The screen, rolled up, hides its secrets. On his desk, letters, not to Victoria Eugenie, not to ministers, to a woman named simply M. Historians still debate who she was. The letters are passionate, almost poetic, and they sit in a drawer that no one catalogued until long after his death. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in the 1930s, Alfonso was already teetering. He went into exile, abdicated unofficially, lost his country, lost his power, but never lost his habits. He died in Rome in 1941, estranged from his wife, estranged from most of Spain. His funeral was modest by royal standards. His cinematic hobbies were still hidden, until the reels surfaced, and suddenly the world remembered. Alfonso III, the man born a king, died not in grandeur, but in mystery. A monarch whose passions didn't sit neatly beside a crown, but hid in cabinets, behind drawn curtains, and on screens never meant for public eyes. You rise now from the study, the projector humming softly behind you. The room darkens, and a single reel keeps spinning, because sometimes history doesn't fade, it flickers. The last reel clicks to silence, and now you emerge into a room filled with candlelight and contradiction. The air smells of beeswax and old ink. You're in Sweden, mid-17th century, in a palace where the draperies are heavy, the tapestries regal, and the queen refuses to be either. You are in the curious and electrifying orbit of Queen Christina of Sweden, a monarch who defied every expectation, discarded every traditional role, and left a trail of baffled courtiers, confused ambassadors, and broken engagement contracts in her wake. She was born in 1626, daughter of King Gustavus Adolphus, who died in battle when she was just 6. Raised as the heir to the throne, she was groomed like a prince, not a princess. She was taught military strategy, philosophy, statecraft, Greek, Latin, logic. She could out-argue any theologian, out-debate any politician, and outwit most of the men who later tried to marry her. And many did try, but Christina, she would have none of it. From the very beginning, she refused to conform to gender expectations. She dressed in men's clothes. She wore boots and carried weapons. She rode, fenced, and cursed like a soldier. Her hair was left unbound. Her posture was regal, but not dainty. She openly stated that marriage and motherhood disgusted her. And when she was pressed to take a husband and produce an heir, she replied simply, "I have no inclination to marry." You glance at her now, seated at the head of her long council table, one boot resting on the chair beside her, a quill in her hand, and 3 stunned bishops across from her blinking in disbelief. But the rumours, oh, the rumours, swirled with as much drama as a French salon. Her closest companion for many years was a noblewoman named Ebba Spare, whom Christina called her bedfellow and the delight of my eyes. The letters between them are filled with tenderness and passion. In one, Christina writes, "I embrace you 1,000 times with all my heart." Ebba was officially married off, but Christina's feelings remained painfully visible. She once referred to her as "my beloved" in front of the entire court. Historians still argue, were they lovers, romantic friends? Was this the coded language of the 17th century, or something deeper? Christina never married, she never even came close. She once considered a political match with her cousin, but when he suggested they share both throne and bed, she recoiled with a mix of sarcasm and existential dread. Her own advisers were baffled. One courtier wrote, "She speaks of men as if they were lesser creatures." But Christina's most shocking decision came in 1654. She abdicated the throne, voluntarily unprecedented. She handed the crown to her cousin Charles, packed her manuscripts and paintings, and left Sweden behind. Why? Because she had converted to Catholicism in secret. In Protestant Sweden, this was not just controversial, it was treasonous. But Christina had long admired the intellectual breadth and ritual of the Catholic Church. She viewed Protestantism as too rigid, too bureaucratic, so she gave up the throne for faith, art, and freedom. She travelled to Rome, dressed as a man for much of the journey, and entered the city not as a deposed monarch, but as a cultural icon. The Pope welcomed her. Artists courted her favour, philosophers sought her company. She turned her palace into a salon filled with playwrights, scientists, and former spies. One visiting dignitary called her the only woman in Europe who possesses a man's soul. Even in Rome, the rumours continued. Her relationships with women persisted, though always just below the surface. She had a brief, intense friendship with Cardinal Azzolino, a man younger than her, sharp-tongued and brilliant. Their letters were intimate, their arguments legendary, but whether their bond was romantic, platonic, or somewhere in between remains unclear. When Christina died in 1689, Azzolino was by her side. You step into her private study now. The walls are lined with books in 6 languages. Her writing desk is scattered with half-finished letters and a portrait of Ebba Sparre tucked beneath a stack of political pamphlets. A velvet doublet lies across the back of a chair. No crown, no gown, no husband, just a legacy carved from intellect, defiance, and unrelenting independence. Queen Christina was not a woman without love. She was a woman who refused to be defined by it. She loved deeply, stubbornly, unconventionally, and in doing so, she left behind a royal life that felt more like a prison than a privilege. And as you stand by the open window, the Roman wind carrying the scent of candle smoke and library dust, you realize Christina wasn't a queen who stepped down. She was a queen who stepped out, on her own terms. You step into a quieter room now, less opulent, less golden, and far more haunted. There are no grand portraits here, no chandeliers, just the creak of old floorboards, the sound of horses outside a Vienna palace, and a pair of folded gloves on a windowsill that haven't been touched in 100 years. This is not the chamber of a ruling monarch, it's the sitting room of a man whose love story nearly broke an empire before he even had the chance to wear a crown. Tonight, you're tracing the bittersweet path of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, and the love that rewrote royal rules sparked resentment and, according to some, helped light the fuse that exploded into World War I. He wasn't supposed to be the heir. His cousin, Crown Prince Rudolf, had that title, but after Rudolf's tragic and very suspicious death in 1889, his body found alongside his lover in a locked hunting lodge, the line of succession wobbled. Franz Ferdinand stepped in reluctantly, awkwardly, and permanently. He was not charming, not fashionable, not terribly well-liked at court. He had a habit of speaking his mind and often not very kindly. His politics were complicated, his nationalism suspect, and his moustache unfortunate. But then came Sophie Chotek. She wasn't from the right family. That's the short version. She was noble, yes, but not noble enough for the Habsburgs. The imperial court had rules, centuries-old, ironclad, soul-draining rules. A future emperor could not marry just anyone, no matter how beautiful, brilliant, or beloved. But Franz Ferdinand didn't care. He met Sophie while she was serving as a lady-in-waiting to another archduchess. She was dignified, quiet, kind. In a court full of noise and rigid protocol, she was a breath of fresh air. Their romance was cautious at first, hidden. Letters slipped through trusted hands, private meetings arranged between palace events. But eventually it couldn't be hidden. Franz proposed. The Habsburg court exploded. The emperor at the time, Franz Joseph, Franz Ferdinand's uncle, refused the match repeatedly. So did ministers, bishops, everyone. The marriage was considered a morganatic union, meaning Sophie would never be empress. Their children would never inherit the throne. Sophie would have to walk behind her husband at official events. She would never be allowed to sit beside him at state dinners. And Franz Ferdinand said, fine. He agreed to every humiliating condition, every social downgrade, every insult, just to marry her. And he did. In 1900 they were married in a small private ceremony. The emperor did not attend, most of the imperial family stayed away. But Franz and Sophie, they didn't care. They were together. You walk with them now through the gardens of their estate at Konopiště outside of Prague. It's quiet there, far from court. They raised their children in peace. Franz collected weapons and hunted game, strangely romantic in a Habsburg sort of way. Sophie ran the household, raised the children, and stayed mostly out of the political spotlight. But their love was visible, radiant even. When they were alone, they laughed, wrote letters, held hands, and every summer they travelled together, unofficially, sometimes against court orders. Which brings us to Sarajevo. It was June 28, 1914. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were on a tour of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was meant to be political, symbolic, but also it was the anniversary of their wedding. Their children stayed behind. They rode through the city in an open car. Sophie was allowed to sit beside him just this once, thanks to the military nature of the event. And then it happened. A young assassin, Gavrilo Princip, stepped from a crowd and fired 2 bullets. One hit Sophie in the abdomen, one hit Franz in the neck. They died side by side. According to one eyewitness, Franz's last words to her were, "Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children." And then he turned pale, collapsed, and whispered, "It is nothing." It wasn't nothing. Their deaths triggered a cascade of alliances, mobilizations, and declarations that would pull the world into its first global war. Millions would die, empires would collapse, and it all began with a love story the world said should never happen. You stand now in the chapel where their bodies lie, not in the imperial crypt of Vienna where Habsburgs sleep beneath cold marble. No, they were buried together in Artstetten Castle in a small, humble tomb, because the court refused to bury Sophie with the rest of the royal family. Even in death, the rules persisted, but so did their love. You trace the inscription on their tomb, simple, stark, and as you leave the quiet stone chamber, you can almost hear them again. A reluctant prince, a not quite princess, 2 people who chose each other in a world that told them not to. And if that's not a royal romance worth remembering, what is? You step back into Versailles now, but not the Versailles of formal gardens and chandeliered balls. This is a quieter corner, one shrouded in mystery, warmed by discreet laughter, and dusted with just a bit of powdered sugar and scandal. Tonight you're climbing a secret staircase, yes, a real one, into the private chambers of Louis XV, the king who succeeded his great-grandfather Louis XIV, and who brought France not just into a new century, but into an entirely new understanding of royal pleasure. You're going to the Petit Trianon, and eventually to the even more secretive Parc aux Cerfs. If Louis XIV ruled with splendour and public ritual, Louis XV ruled with shadows. His early years were promising. He was dubbed Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. He was handsome, shy, and considered deeply moral in his youth. At 15, he married Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess. Their marriage started warmly, if predictably. She bore him 10 children. She smiled graciously. She held her place. But as the years passed, Louis grew bored, not just with court, but with everything. And so began one of the most notorious royal love lives in European history. The turning point? Madame de Pompadour. Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson was a commoner, but dazzlingly smart. She read Voltaire. She loved art. She was funny, witty, sharp. She caught Louis's eye at a masked ball, and before long she became not just his mistress, but his closest political advisor, art patron, and the orchestrator of much of Versailles' interior design. But here's the twist. After a few years, they stopped sleeping together. They remained devoted, inseparable, but no longer lovers in the traditional sense. So Louis, always hungry for affection and perhaps something else, turned to others. And Pompadour helped him do it. Enter the Parc aux Cerfs, or Stag Park. Despite sounding like a charming picnic spot, it was, in truth, a discreet townhouse near Versailles. Pompadour, working with trusted aides, helped coordinate a rotating system of mistresses for the king, many of them young, anonymous, and discreetly compensated. These weren't grand duchesses or noblewomen. They were shopgirls, daughters of minor officials, pretty faces plucked from obscurity and placed into a gilded trap where everything glittered, but little was truly golden. Each young woman was given fine clothes, careful training in etiquette, and temporary residence at the Parc aux Cerfs. They were told they were serving the king. They were rewarded with pensions and dowries when they left. It was a strange hybrid of privilege and exploitation. Historians still debate how much Louis understood the ethical weight of this system. Some say he saw it as benevolence, lifting girls out of poverty for a brief, privileged stint in royal orbit. Others say it was darker, systemic, calculated. A man of immense power, keeping his desires carefully managed out of view of the public, but known to everyone who mattered. One of the most famous residents was Marie-Louise O'Murphy, a 14-year-old girl painted by Boucher in a famously suggestive pose. Louis saw the portrait. She was sent to the park. She bore him a daughter, and then quietly she was married off to a noble and removed from court life. Again and again the cycle repeated. But Louis was no libertine in the mould of Casanova. He was more like a man addicted to affection, dependent on the presence of soft voices and flattery in a world that increasingly isolated him. His wife, Marie Leschinska, turned a blind eye. She retreated into prayer, embroidery, and maternal dignity. Pompadour died young, mourned by Louis more deeply than any of his lovers. Her successor, Madame du Barry, was a very different woman, cheeky, beautiful, socially ambitious. But even she couldn't save Louis from himself. He aged poorly, grew ill, gout, depression. A court that once called him well-beloved now called him le mal-aimé, the poorly beloved. His final years were spent in a fog of regret and religious panic. He died in 1774, deeply unpopular. The revolution was less than 2 decades away, but in the halls of Versailles, the echoes of his hidden life still remain. The Parc aux Cerfs is gone, the staircase is still there, and the portraits still watching. You pause now in a private salon. The fire crackles, a chair creaks as you sit. Was it love? Was it loneliness? Was it simply the shape affection had to take when a man wore a crown too heavy for intimacy? Louis XV never quite answered that, and now, in the silence of Versailles, the question lingers, hovering in candlelight like perfume. You leave behind the perfumed secrecy of Versailles and follow the snow-heavy winds eastward, across mountains and mist, until you find yourself high in the Bavarian Alps. There, among pine forests and blue lakes, a castle rises like a dream, or perhaps a hallucination. Its spires pierce the clouds, its halls echo with opera. And its king, he's asleep during the day, wandering at night, writing letters to dead composers. This is Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King, the fairy tale king. The man who built castles no one asked for, wrote love letters no one answered, and lived a life that still leaves historians whispering, wondering, and reaching for metaphors that don't quite capture the sadness in his eyes. You step now into Neuschwanstein Castle, his most famous creation. It looks medieval, but it was built in the 19th century, entirely out of Ludwig's imagination. He designed it not for guests or glory, but as a personal fantasy space dedicated to his greatest love, Richard Wagner. Yes, the Richard Wagner, the composer. Ludwig discovered Wagner's music as a teenager and became obsessed not just with the art, but with the man. When Ludwig ascended the throne at age 18, he summoned Wagner to court almost immediately. He funded him, protected him, wrote him letters full of florid poetic devotion. He called him my beloved friend and my only refuge. Wagner, for his part, was flattered and flattered himself, and accepted the money. But his feelings were, at best, complicated. He was already married, always manipulating, and never as emotionally available as Ludwig hoped. Still, their letters were charged with something that felt more than friendship. Ludwig wrote, "I long to press you to my heart." Wagner replied, "Strategically." Historians still argue whether Ludwig's love for Wagner was romantic, platonic, or hopelessly idealized. Probably all three. But one thing's certain, Ludwig craved a connection that no one at court could provide. He never married. He was once engaged to his cousin, Duchess Sophie, but the engagement fell apart. His letters to her were affectionate but cool, nothing like the ones he wrote to Wagner, or later, to a series of young, handsome servants and soldiers. Ludwig expressed intense feelings, gifted jewelry, and wrote florid poetry to men who often didn't or couldn't respond in kind. And in the silence, Ludwig built castles, 3 of them. Neuschwanstein, his most famous, was never completed. It was filled with murals from Wagner's operas, swan motifs, painted grottos, and rooms designed for a king who dined alone. It wasn't a palace for receiving guests. It was a fantasy fortress, a place to hide. And hide he did. Ludwig became increasingly nocturnal. He slept all day, wandered the halls at night. He dismissed ministers, cancelled audiences, avoided politics. His government grew frustrated, his people confused. The king who should have ruled now lived entirely in his own private world of art, music, and unspoken longing. By the 1880s, rumours swirled. He spent lavishly on castles, costumes, Wagner's debts. His ministers declared him insane. A team of doctors, none of whom examined him directly, declared him unfit to rule. He was deposed. 2 days later, Ludwig took a walk with one of those doctors, Bernhard von Gudden, by Lake Starnberg. They never returned. Their bodies were found in the water. The official story, Ludwig drowned, and von Gudden either tried to save him or was killed by the king in a sudden psychotic break. But many suspect foul play. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. There was no water in his lungs. No autopsy was ever performed. Even in death, Ludwig remains an enigma. You sit now in the Hall of the Singers, where Ludwig once imagined hosting Wagnerian operas that never came. The chandeliers hang like frozen tears. The painted walls echo silently. What did Ludwig want? Maybe love, maybe escape, maybe someone who would look at him, not as a king, but as a soul. He wrote once, "I wish to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others." And so he did. Even now, as tourists walk his empty halls and swans glide past his empty windows, Ludwig's heart seems to linger somewhere just out of reach, between fantasy and memory, between devotion and disappointment, between what he gave and what he never quite received. Now the candle flickers low and your footsteps take you deeper into the 19th century, into a palace where everything gleams, polished parquet floors, crystal mirrors, and imperial ambition polished to a high shine. But beneath the sparkle lies something more tender. A woman who married into glory and found herself trapped in the reflection of it. You are in the imperial court of Austria once more, but this time following the tragic, restless heart of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known more famously as Sisi. Yes, Sisi, the woman whose hair alone required hours of care each day, whose waist was reportedly just 19 inches, and whose beauty was both her armor and her prison. But tonight, you're not meeting the portrait. You're meeting the woman behind it. It began with a detour. She wasn't meant to be empress. Her older sister was. But in 1853, when the young Emperor Franz Joseph, disciplined, dutiful, somewhat painfully sincere, was introduced to Sisi's family to court her older sibling, it was the 15-year-old Sisi who stole his heart. She was shy, poetic, a little awkward, and had no interest in imperial life. Naturally, he proposed to her almost immediately. She was stunned, So was everyone else. The marriage happened fast, and then the fairy tale curdled. The imperial court was rigid, cold, governed by Franz Joseph's mother, the iron-willed Archduchess Sophie, who immediately began controlling everything about Cece's new life, her dresses, her diet, her children. Yes, her children. Cece bore her first daughter, Sophie, only to have the baby whisked away and raised by her mother-in-law. Cece was allowed no say. When that child died of illness during a trip to Hungary, Cece was blamed. She began to wither under the weight of court expectation. She withdrew, refused to eat. Spent hours on her hair and her figure, not out of vanity, but as an act of control. If she couldn't rule her life, she would rule her body. She consumed raw milk, slices of orange, and almost nothing else. She wrapped her waist in leather belts to maintain her famously tiny silhouette. And Franz Joseph, he loved her dearly, but he was married to the idea of duty. His love came with no rebellion, no escape. He was affectionate but rigid, emotional but immovable. He watched her retreat from him and didn't know how to follow. Their marriage became a thing of letters and pauses. Cece wandered. She travelled constantly, rare for a woman of her station. She visited Hungary frequently and fell in love with the Hungarian people, culture, and, perhaps, Count Gyula Andrassy, a dashing politician and confidant. Now here's where it gets whispered. Their letters were frequent, their closeness deep. Rumours swirled that he was the true love of her life. Some even suggest that their relationship went beyond friendship. But historians still argue there is no proof. Only soft phrases, long glances, and an intimacy that suggests something more. Cece negotiated Hungary's partnership with Austria, helping to broker the dual monarchy in 1867. At Andrassy's side, she wasn't just a pretty face. She was a political force, but no matter how far she travelled, grief always followed. Her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in what was ruled a suicide pact at Meierling with his young lover, Baroness Mary Wetzera. The shock tore through Cece's soul. She dressed in black for the rest of her life, refused to appear in public, refused to be photographed. She became a ghost, drifting through Europe, protected by loyal servants and an ever-present sense of melancholy. She took up poetry, wrote of death, freedom, and the sea. She identified with mythic figures like Icarus and Prometheus, and everywhere she went she was followed, not just by guards, but by loneliness. She was in Geneva when it finally happened. In 1898 she was stabbed in the heart by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, who had intended to kill a royal of any kind. Cece, travelling under an alias, had been walking near the lakeside when he struck. She collapsed, thought it was nothing at first, but the blade had pierced her pericardium. She died quietly in her hotel room, unaware of how deeply the world would mourn her. Now you're with her again, seated beside the great lake. The water glitters. The wind is cool. A black veil flutters in the air, weightless. Her eyes are calm, tired, curious. She turns to you not as an empress, but as a woman who was never truly allowed to just be. She was a queen of hearts who never wanted a crown, and she loved, fiercely, secretly, across borders and boundaries. Whether it was her distant husband, her elusive children, or the maybe lover who stood at her side in Hungary, Cece gave her heart in fragments, and received just enough in return to keep her wandering. She once wrote, "I am a seagull of no land, I call no shore my home. I am bound to no place, I fly from wave to wave." And so she flies still. You find yourself now not in a palace, but in a parlour. A velvet chair, a half-finished letter on the side table, and somewhere in the background, a distant sound of cannon fire. The year is 1917, and the empire that once sprawled across a sixth of the globe is starting to tremble. Tonight you're in the gilded halls, and soon the prison walls of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia the last monarchs of the Romanov dynasty, and you're about to witness a love story so intense, so intertwined, it may have doomed an empire. Nicholas and Alexandra were in love, not diplomatically, not politically, deeply, personally, profoundly in love. From the moment the shy young heir met Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, he was smitten. He called her Sonny. She called him Nicky. Their letters are some of the most romantic and strangely normal exchanges to survive any royal couple. They whispered about the children, sent doodles, called each other silly names. If you didn't know better, you'd think it was a young couple from a small town, not the rulers of the largest empire on earth. But their love was unpopular from the start. Alix converted to Russian Orthodoxy, took the name Alexandra Feodorovna, and stepped into a court that viewed her as cold, foreign, and far too serious. She struggled with public appearances, smiled rarely. She didn't charm the aristocracy, and worse, she didn't try. Nicholas, for his part, was a sweet man, a devoted husband, a loving father, and utterly unsuited to rule. He lacked the steel of his grandfather or the cunning of his ancestors. He wanted to live in the countryside, raise his family, and tinker with model ships. Instead, he inherited an empire cracking under modern pressures. And then came the real heartbreak. After 4 daughters, each met with polite disappointment, they finally had a son, Alexei, the heir. But he was born with haemophilia, a life-threatening blood disorder inherited from Queen Victoria's line. Every bruise could kill him, every fall could become a crisis. Alexandra was consumed with anxiety. She isolated herself, prayed constantly, tried every remedy, spiritual, medical, mystical. And that's how Rasputin entered their lives. The bearded, dishevelled mystic from Siberia reportedly had a calming influence on Alexei. When doctors failed, Rasputin sometimes succeeded, whether through hypnosis, prayer, or coincidence, no one knows. But it gave Alexandra hope. She became utterly devoted to him. Historians still argue whether Rasputin actually wielded political power or whether Alexandra simply believed he could. But the court was horrified, the public disgusted. Rumors exploded of orgies, cults, manipulation. In truth, Rasputin may have been more fraud than fiend, but the damage to the monarchy was real. Nicholas trusted his wife, Alexandra trusted Rasputin, and the empire crumbled under the weight of that trust. Meanwhile, World War I bled the country dry. Nicholas took personal command of the army, leaving Alexandra in charge of internal affairs. The Duma resented it. The people starved. The revolution began to stir, and in all this they still wrote letters. From the front lines, Nicholas wrote to Alexandra, "I long for you and the children. I kiss you tenderly, my own darling Sonny." She replied, "Remember how much I love you, and how proud I am to be your wife." It would have been beautiful if it hadn't been historically catastrophic. In 1917, the February Revolution exploded. Nicholas abdicated. The royal family was placed under house arrest. The children were confused but obedient. Alexandra's health deteriorated. Nicholas kept journaling, noting the weather and chess games, even as his world vanished. Eventually, they were moved to Yekaterinburg, to a house ironically called the House of Special Purpose. And there, on a quiet July night in 1918, they were led to a basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, the family doctor, and several loyal servants. The guards read a brief sentence, and then opened fire. It was brutal, chaotic, botched. The daughters had jewels sewn into their corsets which deflected bullets. The assassins panicked, bayonets were used, smoke filled the room, and then silence. The love letters stopped. The Romanov story ended, not in marble, but in blood and dust. But if you step carefully into that room now, into that frozen moment, you can still hear it, not the shots, but the silence between them. Alexandra leaning slightly toward Nicholas, his hand brushing hers, the girls whispering to each other. Alexei blinking, trying to be brave. A family, a tragedy, a love story too human for the empire it carried. Now only photographs remain. Their last family portrait shows them standing together, close but not touching, eyes heavy with something we now recognize not as majesty, but as fate. You pause now as the candle gutters low again, in a room once filled with voices, the empress who loved too hard, the Tsar who ruled too gently, and the children who never got to choose. And now, from the frozen shadows of Yekaterinburg, your thoughts drift westward, toward marble halls, glistening carriages, and the sound of polite applause barely hiding the grind of scandal behind it. You arrive in England, late 19th century, where public morality sat rigidly on a pedestal while private desire danced underneath the table. Tonight you're shadowing a prince who waited far too long to be king and found more than enough mischief to fill the time. You're meeting Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, but for now, simply Bertie. Bertie was the son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and from birth he was expected to be a moral symbol of empire. He did not cooperate. While his father was precise, upright, and impossibly proper, Bertie preferred cigars, card games, flirtation, and dinner parties that stretched until dawn. He was charming, plump, perpetually overdressed. He had the easy confidence of someone who knew that no matter what he did, he would never have to apply for a job. And the women? Oh, there were many. From aristocrats to actresses, Bertie's love life was a gilded carousel, each affair raising royal eyebrows and newspaper headlines. He was Britain's most eligible and scandalous bachelor for decades. Among his mistresses were the famous actress Lily Langtry, the elegant and married Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, and the sharp-tongued Alice Keppel, whose great-granddaughter, by the way, is Camilla, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom today. History does love its loops. Through it all, Bertie remained married to Princess Alexandra of Denmark, graceful, patient, and widely admired for her beauty and dignity. She endured his indiscretions with a quiet strength, rarely commenting, never publicly complaining. Their relationship was complex. They cared deeply for one another. But romantic intimacy dwindled early on. Some speculate Alexandra's health issues, others point to Bertie's short attention span. Regardless, they remained united in public. Behind closed doors, their lives diverged. Now, if you're thinking, this sounds messy, well, it got messier. One of the most notorious episodes came in 1861 when Bertie, as a young man, was stationed with the army in Ireland. His fellow officers thought he needed experience and arranged a rendezvous with a certain Nellie Clifton, a courtesan. Word got back to Queen Victoria, and she was furious, not just disappointed, devastated. Her beloved husband, Prince Albert, travelled to confront Bertie. Weeks later, Albert died of typhoid. Victoria, in her grief, blamed Bertie, not for the disease, but for breaking his father's heart. It haunted their relationship. For years afterward, Victoria barely spoke to her son. She excluded him from state affairs. She described him as unfit, immature, and frivolous. So Bertie doubled down on what he knew, society life. He became the unofficial king of London's high society, hosted lavish dinners, introduced French cuisine to England, popularized wearing a dinner jacket, yes, the tuxedo. He even had a custom-built love seat in Paris with convenient armholes and tilting mechanisms, for reasons we will leave gently to the imagination. Yet despite it all, he had a strange popularity. The public loved him. He was relatable. He laughed, he ate too much, he flirted shamelessly. He seemed more human than the austere Victoria, locked in mourning for decades. And then in 1901 she died. After 59 years as heir, Bertie finally became King Edward VII at the age of 59. He reigned for just 9 years, but what a 9 years they were. He proved to be surprisingly capable, diplomatic, skilled at smoothing international tensions. His charm, once a liability, became an asset on the world stage. He even helped lay the groundwork for the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France. But still, the lovers remained. Even as king, Alice Keppel remained his constant companion. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a political sounding board, a social organizer, and in many ways the person who truly understood him. When Edward fell ill in 1910, it was Keppel who was summoned. She wept at his bedside. Alexandra, ever composed, allowed her in. He died as he had lived, surrounded by women, cigars, and whispered apologies. Historians still argue whether Edward's love life weakened or humanized the monarchy. He didn't break the institution, but he certainly wrinkled it. And yet his mistresses helped shape politics, fashion, and culture. His affairs were scandalous, yes, but also, strangely, foundational to the world of modern celebrity. You sit now in a richly upholstered salon. The air smells of pipe smoke and expensive cologne. Laughter echoes from a distant room. You hear his voice, plump with charm, raspy with age, asking for champagne, for gossip, for another hour before facing the cabinet ministers. Love, for Edward, was many things: pleasure, companionship, distraction, necessity. He never apologized for it. And history, oddly enough, never quite punished him for it either. The velvet curtains close on Edward's candle-lit salons, and now you walk down quieter corridors, ones lined with echoing silence, brooding portraits, and the soft chime of a clock marking history that nearly never happened. You are entering the interwar years of the 20th century. This time the love wasn't just scandalous, it was abdicated. You're stepping into the story of Edward VIII and the king who gave up the crown for love. It sounds romantic. It is romantic, but also messy, political, and still debated over tea tables and textbooks alike. Edward was the eldest son of Edward VII's son. Yes, we're deep in the royal relay race now. Born in 1894, he was the golden prince of his generation, charismatic, stylish, adored by the public. Women swooned, men tried to copy his haircut. He was called David by his family, but to the nation he became simply the Prince of Wales. And David loved being loved. He partied hard in the roaring 20s, travelled extensively, dated liberally, fell in and out of liaisons with married women, actresses, and hostesses. But by the early 1930s, one name stood out: Wallis Simpson. She was American, divorced once, married again, sharp, chic, and entirely unsuitable by every traditional royal standard. But David was enchanted, obsessed, dependent. He wrote her daily letters, needy, vulnerable, infatuated. She was witty, confident, and seemed to give him the emotional stability he never found elsewhere. His friends noticed, his family panicked. By 1936, his father George V had died, and Edward became King Edward VIII. The throne was his, and so was the crisis, because Edward wasn't interested in reigning alone. He wanted to marry Wallis. And that, for the Church of England, the British government, and the empire itself, was a catastrophe. She wasn't just American, she wasn't just divorced. Her second husband was still alive. And as king, Edward was also supreme governor of the church, which forbade remarriage after divorce if the ex-spouse was still living. Cue constitutional chaos. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin told him flatly he couldn't marry Wallis and remain king. So Edward chose. In December 1936, after just 396 days on the throne, he broadcast a message to the world. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love." With that, he abdicated. He became Duke of Windsor. His brother Bertie became King George XIII, father of Queen Elizabeth II. And Edward? He married Wallis in a quiet ceremony in France in 1937. No royal family members attended. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? But the story doesn't stop there, because what followed was a lifetime of half-exile, awkward holidays, and cold receptions. Edward and Wallis lived mostly in France, surrounded by society types and poodles, receiving polite notes, but not real invitations, from the rest of the Windsors. And then came World War II and a strange new controversy. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas, essentially exiled to a warm, far-off outpost. There were rumours, never fully proven, that he and Wallis had pro-German sympathies. Edward had visited Hitler in 1937. Letters emerged suggesting they were seen by some in the Nazi regime as potential collaborators if Britain fell. Historians still argue just how serious it was. Was it naivete, sympathy, mere gossip? But the result was clear. Edward was quietly pushed further and further out of royal relevance. He published memoirs, gave interviews, attended society parties, but he never really fit anywhere again. He had love, but lost his country. Wallis, for her part, never seemed quite as emotionally invested. She often wrote about being trapped, about being mocked. She kept up appearances, wore couture, smiled for photographers, but behind the diamonds was a life of carefully staged exile. Some suggest she never truly wanted to marry Edward, that she preferred the attention, the thrill, not the consequence. But once the king had given up his crown, she couldn't say no. And so they lived, for decades, as perhaps the most famous royal cautionary tale of the 20th century. They were buried side by side in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. It was Queen Elizabeth II, years later, who allowed it. A quiet reconciliation, a soft closing of a painful chapter. You sit now in their drawing room in Paris. The curtains are heavy, the air smells of perfume and old cigars. Edward is older, watching the news. Wallis flips through a magazine, wearing a bracelet worth more than a yacht. They loved, but they lost. And whether they thought it was worth it, they never quite said. The Paris flat grows dimmer as you step out, trailing behind the ghost of a king who gave up everything. But the timeline doesn't rest. The crown passed down, the world changed, and soon love would find itself again, tangled not in exile, but in tabloid ink. Now you slip through the polished gates of Buckingham Palace, where the next chapter in this tangled tapestry unfolds. It's a tale more recent, more televised, and far less fairy tale than anyone hoped. You're walking into the complicated, scrutinized, and endlessly dissected love triangle of Prince Charles, Princess Diana, and Camilla Parker Bowles, and it all starts with a match that was never quite meant to match. In the late 1970s, Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, polo enthusiast, soft-spoken, fond of plants, was under increasing pressure to marry. The Windsors needed a queen in waiting, the press needed a romance, the monarchy needed good optics, and then came Lady Diana Spencer. She was young, shy, from a noble family. A kindergarten teacher, just 19 when the public began noticing her. Charles was 12 years older. Their courtship was short, awkward, and heavily curated, but it checked the boxes. They married in 1981 in what was called a fairy tale wedding. But inside the carriage, Diana already felt alone, because lurking in the background, never truly in the background, was Camilla. Charles had met Camilla years earlier. They shared interests, country life, books, dry humour, and a mutual comfort that Charles, even today, rarely shows with anyone else. But Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles. The timing had never worked, yet their connection never faded. Even after marrying Diana, Charles continued to lean on Camilla. They spoke often, saw each other. Slowly, subtly, the line between old friendship and emotional affair blurred. Then it wasn't just emotional anymore. And Diana knew. She once told a BBC interviewer famously, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Oof. The world had adored Diana, the people's princess. Her empathy, her warmth, her ability to make even the most rigid royal appearances feel human. She visited AIDS patients when others wouldn't. She walked through minefields. She held hands with children, and elderly and homeless alike. And behind the scenes, she battled bulimia, depression, and the crushing weight of a marriage that never felt secure. Charles, meanwhile, felt trapped in a relationship that seemed perfect to everyone but the people inside it. He resented the public's adoration of Diana. He felt misunderstood, even ridiculed, and he retreated more and more into the familiar presence of Camilla. The press caught wind. The public speculated. Then came the tapes, the books, the interviews. Charles admitted to adultery. So did Diana. The monarchy teetered. The Queen was not amused. In 1996, Charles and Diana officially divorced. And then just a year later, 1997, came the tragedy. Diana died in a car crash in Paris, hounded by paparazzi, mourned by the world. The royal family's initial silence was met with public outcry. Crowds piled flowers at palace gates. People wept in the streets. It was as if the heart of the nation had broken in real time. Charles flew to Paris to retrieve her body, walked behind her coffin, bowed his head as she passed. The man she once called unfit to be king stood in mourning, his grief tangled with guilt. Camilla was nowhere in sight. It would take years, decades, for her to be accepted by the public. The Queen herself reportedly withheld formal approval for quite some time. Slowly, though, things shifted. Charles and Camilla appeared in public, attended events, stood a bit closer each time. In 2005, they married, quietly, civilly, with the Queen's blessing. Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall, later Queen Consort, and, depending on who you ask, the final piece in a puzzle that never quite fit from the beginning. Historians still argue whether Charles and Camilla's love was destiny deferred or selfishness disguised as fate. Was Diana a casualty of a system that forced mismatched unions? Was Charles a man torn between duty and affection? Or were they all simply flawed, human, and cornered by an institution that rarely bends? You now walk through the manicured gardens of Clarence House. The hedges are neat, the gravel path crunches underfoot. Inside, an old radio plays classical music. Charles talks to a tree. Camilla flips a page in her book. They seem content, not glamorous, not legendary, just settled. The story doesn't end here, of course. It moves forward now with William and Kate, Harry and Meghan, and an entirely new generation of royal love stories, each with its own shade of controversy. But this one, Charles, Diana, Camilla, is a reminder that monarchs may reign, but they don't always get to love freely. And when they try to, the cost is rarely just their own. You stand now at the edge of centuries, where velvet curtains, secret passageways, and murmured scandals all begin to fade. The modern monarchy is quieter, though no less scrutinized, and tonight your journey through the secret love lives of European royals finds its soft final act. No more galloping horses, no more glittering balls, just a gentle hush settling over history. As you settle into your imaginary chair, let's say it's carved oak by a flickering hearth, you glance one last time at the love stories that came before. Some ended in passion, others in tragedy, some in whispered exile, and some, they linger still in diaries, portraits, and half-forgotten letters, folded and tucked away behind time. You begin where you started, not with one monarch, but with a question that refuses to go away. What happens when power meets desire? Because kings and queens may have ruled countries, but they rarely ruled their hearts. They married for alliances, slept for strategy, loved across class lines and gender expectations, in bedrooms not marked on blueprints. They snuck out side doors, penned poetry under fake names, and sometimes gave up crowns just to hold a hand that made the world feel soft. From France to Bavaria, Russia to England, we saw emperors chasing ballerinas, tsars exiling lovers, kings building castles for men who wouldn't stay, and princes walking away from it all, for one woman in a Paris apartment. And through it all, love was rarely tidy, it was rarely fair, but it was always, deeply, undeniably, human. Historians still argue whether these tales reveal weakness, or something closer to courage, because to love when your portrait hangs in Parliament, to long for someone when the laws forbid it, to fall, knowing the papers will devour it the next morning, that's not just scandal, that's vulnerability with a crown on. So you rest your eyes now. Let the drama settle into the dust of embroidered sheets. Somewhere, a chandelier flickers. A letter slips from a drawer. A pressed flower from 1764 crumbles into nothing. The story is over, but the people in it were never just characters. They were lonely, rebellious, romantic, restless, just like you. And now, as the last pages of tonight's tale fall gently closed, you can feel your breath slow, your body soften, and your mind begin to drift, away from coronets and court intrigues, away from marble staircases and chandeliers swinging slightly in the candlelight. You've walked through centuries tonight. You've stood beside queens in silk slippers, heard the creak of castle doors, smelled the perfume of forbidden visitors. You've felt the quiet ache behind velvet curtains, and the warm pulse of secret notes passed under tables. And through it all, the world kept turning. Monarchs rose and fell, lovers came and went, and somewhere, someone always waited behind a curtain, hoping their name would never be whispered, but knowing it always would be. But that was then. Right now, all that matters is the softness of your pillow, the rhythm of your breath, the quiet hum of night just outside your window. Let the castles dissolve now. Let the gossip fade like candle smoke curling toward a starless sky. Let the gowns, the gloves, the golden goblets all slide gently away, just images now in the warm folds of your imagination, because you're not in Versailles or Vienna anymore. You're here, safe and still, and there's nothing left to do but rest, so sink just a little deeper. And as the last names blur into silence, know this: even the grandest love stories end in sleep, and yours is just beginning.